What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Omni-sensei here with What If I Were Reborn in Mushoku Tensei as a Beast Monarch? Part 3. If you enjoy this type of content, please super smash that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Don't forget to check out the original story linked in the description. Let's dive into the rise of a Beast Monarch without further ado. The hall was steeped in tension. Rigger gripped his glowing sword tightly, now dimming the intensity of the flames to conserve mana, his eyes scanning every movement. I've lost the initiative. The situation isn't in my favor. I need an opening. Oh, your brother, even in death, lied about your race not having innate abilities. He was sad about not being invited to the party, you know, he taunted, directing his words at the black troll. What? The black troll roared, lifting his axe in fury and preparing to charge. But before he could, Gallus shouted at him, "Calm down, River. He's provoking you. Don't forget, this brat almost took your head off a moment ago." Ahead of him, Gallus Cleaner remained calm, his right hand already holding a new sword to replace the one he had thrown. The North Saint wore a cold smile on his face, while the black troll, a massive creature, had slightly calmed, though his rage still burned beneath the surface. "So, you're not the leader, huh? Looks like you're just a lapdog." Rigger tried again, readying himself for the inevitable clash. "Do not underestimate him," Gallus warned, his voice sharp as steel. "If you hesitate because he's a child, you will die. Surround him and attack together. This must be the beast boy who massacred the 5 of the icy cold or something. He can use chantless magic. Once again, don't underestimate him." The warriors around him seemed to take the warning seriously, their dismissive expressions replaced with grim determination. Before Rigger could make his move, the black troll let out a roar that echoed through the hall and charged forward with overwhelming speed, utterly disproportionate to his massive size. His steps thundered like a storm, and the axe he carried looked powerful enough to cleave through a fortress wall. Rigger spun his sword in time, but the attack was too fast. The impact of the axe against his flaming blade created a shockwave so powerful that it hurled him to the other side of the hall, nearly slamming him into a stone wall. "This guy is incredibly strong, maybe even stronger than me," Rigger thought, but there was no time to hesitate. Before he could recover, he noticed a dagger spinning toward him. In the blink of an eye, he used Flash Step, vanishing from his position at the last moment. The dagger embedded itself in the wall with enough force to crack it. Gallus watched with cold eyes and a smirk, his hand still extended from the calculated throw. "You're fast," Gallus remarked, amused. Rigger reappeared in the middle of the hall, ready to strike at anyone in sight. But before he could reorient himself, the advanced warriors began to encircle him, their footsteps echoing against the stone floor. He could hear the whispered words of magical incantations being chanted in the background. "Damn," he muttered, his eyes sparking with determination. In one fluid motion, he raised his sword. The flames enveloping it danced with ferocious intensity. Without wasting time, he unleashed a fiery blade in a devastating arc, striking 3 warriors advancing from the left. The impact was brutal, incinerating the enemies in a burst of heat and fire. But there was no time to celebrate. The black troll, now with an even more furious expression, appeared behind him again, swinging his axe in a horizontal blow that promised to cut Rigger in half. Rigger spun on his heels, his sword still ablaze, and blocked the massive blow at the last moment. The force of the impact made his hands tremble, sparks flying as the blades collided. He felt the weight of the axe pushing him backward. The black troll roared, holding the axe with one hand while throwing a sideways punch with the other, aimed at Rigger. At the same time, Rigger aimed a kick at the troll's ribs. The blows collided, creating a powerful pressure in the air from the impact. Once again, Rigger confirmed that this creature was stronger than him as he was pushed back. He quickly raised an earth wall to block 2 warriors and the water cannon spell the mages had fired at him. He channeled magic into his legs and exploded to the side with a flash step, escaping the range of the axe chasing him. In the same motion, he spun his sword, creating a fiery arc around him that forced the nearby warriors to retreat. The advanced mages had already completed their incantations. 2 massive spells hurtled toward Rigger, a spiked earth projectile and a sharp ice lance. He channeled his magic into a barrier strong enough to withstand the spells and turned his attention back to Gallus, blocking yet another ambush. If it weren't for his instincts and senses warning him, he was sure Gallus would have landed a few hits by now. The ice lance struck the shield with a resounding crack, shards of ice flying in all directions, while the spiked earth projectile activated harmlessly against the barrier. As he moved through the structure, Rigger leaped to the second floor, which was already on the verge of collapse after so many spells and impacts. He planted his sword into the wooden floor to halt his momentum. "He must be getting tired," one of the advanced warriors whispered, jumping to pursue Rigger. "Press now. If we attack together now, we can kill him." Another warrior nodded, circling around. "Be careful. This kid is a monster. One wrong move, and we're the ones who'll fall." Their exchanged glances were brief but filled with determination. With a battle cry, they charged in unison. Rigger noticed the approach of multiple warriors surrounding him. In one fluid motion, he launched himself into the air, spinning in an acrobatic leap. He then created his most lethal and still unrefined magic, a vacuum sphere. Without aiming in a specific direction, he unleashed the sphere, which exploded outward while he retreated with burst step. The vacuum sphere detonated, riddling several warriors with holes and destroying the building's main support pillar. As he landed, Rigger raised a stone platform beneath his feet, elevating himself above the enemy attacks. Jumping to another platform he conjured, he unleashed spikes of earth that erupted violently from the ground, impaling two pursuing warriors. They fell lifeless as Rigger landed on a third platform, but the troll smashed it before it fully formed, forcing him to confront the beast again. "What's the matter, boy? You invaded so boldly, and now you're running." The troll, caught in the frenzy of battle, let out a wild laugh. The troll was powerful, but Rigger was faster. He quickly outmaneuvered the creature in combat. Rigger's sword shot upward with incredible speed toward the troll's solar plexus, but as it struck, a shining black barrier reappeared from the demon's body. The impact ricocheted, generating a wave of energy that sent Rigger flying backward. While airborne, he continuously used healing magic to mend his minor injuries and raised another earth barrier to protect himself from a massive fireball launched by a mage. "What an irritating racial ability," Rigger murmured, thinking of a way to bypass it. Suddenly, he burst forward with a burst step toward the mages. "Annoying flies," he muttered, slashing his flaming sword and cleaving the two mages in half with the longsword of light. The black troll chased him relentlessly. Despite its strength, its intelligence seemed lacking. Rigger was more concerned about Gallus, who had stopped appearing. He had already noticed some of the warriors fleeing and hoped Gallus wasn't one of them. The troll swung its axe in a vertical strike. This time, Rigger was ready. He used the first stage of flow from the water god style, dodging by mere inches, and thrust the longsword of light at the troll's chest, confident it would pierce the armor. But instead of using the shining dark energy again, the troll blocked with its arm, taking a clean slash that cut through the armor and deep into the bone, the scent of burning flesh filling the air. Unfazed, the troll used the sword embedded in its flesh to hurl Rigger into a pillar with a roar. "Well, boy, I thought you were stronger if you dared to attack us." One of the warriors mocked from a distance as he and 5 others approached slowly. Rigger wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth and stood up. "Don't worry. I'm just getting warmed up." He channeled magic into his sword again, but this time with even greater intensity. The blade began to blaze with blue flames, roaring uncontrollably. The complex was in ruins. Walls that were once solid now lay in shattered pieces. Chunks of stone and wood were scattered across the ground, and entire columns had collapsed. With every move, Rigger and the troll created a spectacle of chaos. His body moved like a flaming blur, while sword strikes ignited the air around them. He leapt through the rubble, dodging coordinated attacks. 3 advanced warriors pursued him relentlessly, striking with glowing swords. The black troll followed closely, crushing what remained of the ground with every step. Rigger felt the weight of the battle, but he wasn't tired yet, and surprisingly, he wasn't even close to exhausting his mana. The heat of his sword mixed with the sweat on his brow as he kept fighting. He spun, blocking an attack from one warrior, and kicked a pile of debris into another's face. In the same instant, he unleashed a horizontal slash with his flaming blade, incinerating one of his pursuers with deadly precision. "I won't last forever like this," he thought. "Every time I get a chance to land a fatal blow on the troll, my instincts tell me otherwise. Gallus is just waiting for an opening." As he dodged another strike from the troll, Rigger decided to feign exhaustion to lure Gallus in. To his surprise, he felt a presence behind him. It was fast, almost imperceptible, but he was trained to react to moments like this. With a swift turn, he moved his sword backward, planning to strike Gallus by surprise. Finally, he thought. But what he saw upon turning made his mind falter for a millisecond. Gallus was holding a beast girl, one of the servant maids. The Northern Saint's hand was firmly around her neck, using her as a shield. The girl's eyes were wide with fear, tears streaming down her dirt-covered face. In that instant, surprised, Rigger hesitated for a fraction of a second. He knew he should attack. But that sliver of doubt was all Gallus needed. Swish! The steel sliced through the air. Gallus lunged with impressive speed, his longsword tracing a perfect arc. Rigger managed to move at the last moment, avoiding the blade from piercing his heart, but the sword left a deep gash across his chest. Blood gushed out, staining the ground crimson. Arg! Rigger cried out, leaping backward with a sonic burst, using magic to create an explosion of air and escape the troll's deadly follow-up strike. The monster's axe crashed into the ground where Rigger had been, destroying another section of the hall and scattering debris in all directions. Gallus smirked in amusement. "Caught you off guard, boy. I thought you were more ruthless." Rigger took a deep breath, blood dripping from his wound. He began channeling his regeneration magic. The pain subsided, but the weight of the situation remained. Gallus is dangerous, he thought. Alone, I could finish him with a single blow, but he's cunning. He exploits every opening in the middle of my fight with the others, and doesn't let me breathe. Rigger gritted his teeth. If I'd known he would use the girl as a shield, I wouldn't have hesitated. But he caught me by surprise. That won't happen again. While still healing the wound, Rigger was forced to dodge another attack. The three advanced warriors and the black troll charged in unison, coming from every side. Swords and axes swung from all directions, forcing Rigger into a frantic defense. He rolled to the side, climbed a pile of rubble, and used Flash Step to appear behind one of the warriors. But the troll was always close. It kicked a chunk of a pillar with tremendous force. The massive projectile flew toward Rigger, who jumped at the last second, narrowly avoiding the blow. Standing amidst the ruins, Rigger felt the gravity of the situation. He knew this battle would be challenging, but it wasn't supposed to be this hard. The main reason was that he couldn't use his most destructive attacks. A massive fireburst or a localized earthquake would give him a significant advantage. But he also knew the slaves were trapped in the underground levels. If I destroy everything, they'll die, he thought, wiping sweat from his brow. Not that I'd sacrifice my life to save them, but they're the main reason for this invasion. Everything I've done so far would be pointless. If he ended up in a dire situation where he was at a disadvantage, he wouldn't hesitate to destroy everything with large-scale magic. But this stalemate had persisted since the start of the fight. He needed to kill Gallus or the troll. If either fell, he would gain the upper hand. The troll had already proven hard to kill, so Gallus was the target. He needed to change his approach. An idea formed in his mind. What if I froze everything? Nothing would be destroyed, and it would surely be enough to kill Gallus at point-blank range. He just needed to create an opening to channel the magic without being noticed. "Gallus," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the Northern Saint. "Let's see how you handle this." Rigger formed a plan. He used the longsword of light and charged at the remaining warriors, engaging in battle while creating walls of earth and wind bullets to maintain a stalemate with the remaining opponents. 7 advanced warriors, the troll, and Gallus. Meanwhile, he began preparing his next move. Wind started swirling over a wide area, slowly but steadily forming a tornado. Gallus was too cunning and knew he would lose in a direct confrontation. I need to lure him into a trap, he thought, already sketching a strategy. The slaver's base was now a battlefield in ruins. The wreckage of collapsed structures, scattered flames, and debris covered the chaotic scene. At the center of it all, Rigger stood his ground, his eyes fixed on the enemies encircling him. His breathing was heavy, not from genuine exhaustion, but as part of a convincing act. He had already noticed Gallus's extreme caution and needed to feign fatigue in everything he did to lure the man out. He raised his sword, Tsukikage, its blade still emanating golden flames with each strike. Gradually, he was conjuring a tornado around himself, lifting the surrounding debris and causing a momentary uproar among the slavers. The wind roared, scattering shards of wood and metal into the air. But just as the whirlwind seemed to reach full strength, something changed. The flames enveloping his blade vanished abruptly, and the tornado began to falter, its winds becoming erratic and failing before causing any significant damage. While pretending his mana was depleting, Rigger secretly channeled power into his left hand, preparing to unleash an extremely powerful freezing nova. The standoff dragged on, and Gallus showed no signs of appearing. Rigger was already at a disadvantage, fighting without magic against the warriors. Luckily, his superior speed allowed him to maintain the stalemate. He's not taking the bait. I need something more, Rigger thought, adjusting his posture and purposefully letting one shoulder droop as though he were exhausted. He raised his hand and attempted to conjure an earthen wall, something he often did to shield himself in close combat. This time, however, the magic faltered. The wall cracked and crumbled almost immediately. The surrounding warriors attacked him with ferocity, while the black troll grew impatient, its massive axe slamming against the ground with a deep, menacing thud. This isn't enough. I need something more drastic, Rigger thought. He realized he'd have to take some damage to truly convince them he was at his limit. Taking a calculated risk, Rigger moved explosively. He lunged at one of the nearest warriors, a burly man wielding a greatsword. With a single swift motion, Rigger deflected the blade with his own and delivered a devastating punch straight to the man's chest. The blow shattered his armor, crushed his ribcage, and sent him flying backward, already lifeless. The scene was quick and brutal, leaving the remaining warriors momentarily frozen in shock. But this move opened an opportunity for the troll. With a roar, the enormous demon raised his axe and struck a vertical blow with all his might. Rigger spun his blue sword to block the attack, but the impact was monstrous. The force of the blow broke through his defense, throwing him backward like a rag doll. He was hurled into the wreckage of a destroyed wall, which collapsed around him. The pain was real this time, but Rigger turned it into part of his performance. He tried to recover, pretending to cast another earthen wall to cushion his fall, but let the spell fail at the last moment. He hit the ground heavily, groaning in pain. Blood dripped from his forehead, and he trembled as if he were at the limit of his strength. Hey, maybe I should try acting if being a warrior doesn't work out. Finally, he sensed a presence closing in behind him, advancing with speed and certainty. The warriors and the troll were already catching up to him from the front as well. Rigger heard the quick steps and felt his instinct scream. He didn't need to turn to confirm it. He knew Gallus was approaching. With half-closed eyes, Rigger focused all the mana he had been secretly gathering. His gamble now was that Gallus would be confident enough to fall into his trap. Now, Rigger rolled to the ground, raised his hand, and unleashed his magic as fast as he could. A sphere of icy energy expanded rapidly, growing in intensity. The temperature dropped drastically in an instant, the air turning freezing. Gallus, who had been approaching with a smirk, realized the danger too late. His eyes widened, and he began to run away. But Rigger, with a cold smile on his face, muttered, "Too late." The freezing nova exploded, unleashing a wave of extreme cold that froze everything within its reach. The warriors, the black troll, and Gallus himself were caught in the icy blast. Debris, flames, and bodies were instantly encased in thick layers of ice. The sound of the explosion echoed through the ruined base, followed by an eerie silence, broken only by the crackling of ice as it expanded. POV, Gallus cleaner. As I watched the boy fight, I felt a growing sense of unease. This boy was too strong. I had already heard reports about him being stronger than most advanced-level warriors 3 years ago from one of the mercenaries who managed to escape a failed attack. I expected him to have grown stronger in those 3 years, which was why I had allied with that idiot. But he exceeded my expectations. He wanted to kill the boy here. According to his sources, the boy appeared to be only 9 years old. Letting him grow stronger would harm his future business, especially since he was uniting the Great Forest under one banner with that so-called Iron Legion. But I couldn't shake the persistent feeling that the boy was holding back his strength. Moreover, his stamina and mana seemed endless. It's decided, if he doesn't tire or run out of mana soon, I'll retreat. At worst, I'll have to seek protection in Azura. I doubt he would hunt me down there. Fortunately for me, the boy started to show signs of exhaustion. He wasn't entirely monstrous yet, but it was better to be cautious. He might just be faking it. When the boy made a desperate strike against one of the warriors and the troll hit him, I realized it was my chance. There it is. He can't even stand anymore. As I rushed forward to finally finish the boy off, that nagging sense of unease returned. It exploded when I saw the boy smirking at me. Damn it. The last thing I saw was an explosion of white and blue. Rigger fell to his knees, panting. He was badly injured and even a bit tired, but alive. The cold around him was biting, but he remained steady. I did it, he thought, as he surveyed the frozen battlefield he had created. Gallus, the black troll, and the other warriors were motionless, trapped in ice sculptures, their faces frozen in expressions of surprise and fear. Everything was frozen. Rigger's freezing nova had turned the slaver's base into an icy graveyard. The ruined structures, the bodies of the warriors, and even the unconscious slaves in the main hall were covered by thick layers of crystalline ice. The surrounding temperature was sharp, and the landscape had become almost unrecognizable. Rigger breathed heavily, his eyes scanning the frozen field until they fixed on a figure ahead. Gallus turned into an ice statue. Around him, 6 other warriors who had fought alongside the leader were also immobilized, caught in the icy blast. Despite the cost, Rigger felt the sacrifice had been worth it. I did it, he thought, trying to steady his breathing as he placed a hand over his chest, focusing on healing his wounds. He had controlled the magic to divert some of the impact from himself, trusting his extraordinary physique to endure the rest. Now he was freezing, but he wanted to be sure. After all, he had watched plenty of movies to know what might happen in this situation. As he cast a wind spell to shatter the statues, what he expected happened. A deep, resonant sound broke the silence. Before his eyes, the ice encasing the black troll began to crack, and the ice exploded in all directions. Rigger raised his arm to shield himself from the shards, his apathetic eyes observing as the enormous figure broke free. Seriously? Did I raise this flag? The black troll shook off the remaining chunks of ice from his body. His breathing was heavy, and the black aura that had once surrounded him was slowly dissipating. He was injured, frostburn was visible on his thick skin, and his body trembled slightly, but he was still standing. The giant laughed, a deep and guttural sound that echoed across the frozen battlefield. Ha ha! Did you really think you could kill me with that, boy? His voice was hoarse, yet carried an unshakable confidence. Rigger allowed a faint smile to appear on his face. He couldn't fathom where this guy was drawing his confidence from. After all, the advantage was clearly his now. His wounds were slowly healing, and the troll was visibly weakened. How long do you think you can last without your friends helping you? Rigger replied calmly, his voice laced with a provocative tone. He was impressed that this guy wanted to talk. It only gave him more time to heal further. The troll narrowed his eyes but quickly softened his expression into a smile, as if the provocation hadn't affected him. I'll carve your body into pieces and drink your blood in honor of my brother, he said as he stepped forward, dragging his gigantic axe across the ice. But I must admit, you're strong, boy. Few have managed to injure me like this. Let me introduce myself before I kill you. I am River Kinkard of the Demon Tribe Kinkard, and I am the leader of this glorious organization. He spread his arms in a dramatic gesture, as if expecting applause. Rigger stifled a laugh but couldn't suppress the thought. How did someone with such a low IQ manage to create an organization like this? Does he not realize I already killed all his allies by myself? He must have had some excellent assistants. Even so, he decided to play along with the troll, using the conversation to buy more time to fully heal. Rigger Adoldia, of the Adoldia tribe, leader of the Iron Legion. He raised his blue sword, pointing it at his opponent. Shall I consider those your last words? River laughed heartily again, seemingly amused by Rigger's boldness. If I die here, at least it will be at the hands of a great warrior, he replied before raising his axe with both hands. But don't think it'll be so easy, boy. Rigger remained in position, carefully analyzing every move the troll made while continuing to heal his wounds. During the exchange, he had managed to regenerate most of the damage he'd sustained, and now he was confident he could kill him without much trouble. Then come, Rigger said, stepping forward, his sword poised for combat. Show me what you're capable of. With a ferocious roar, River Kinkard charged, his axe slicing through the air as he prepared a deadly blow. Their final battle was about to begin. The troll's protective dark aura, though weakened, was still a formidable barrier that Rigger needed to overcome. He had enough mana to keep fighting, but wasting it like before was no longer an option. As he evaded the massive axe's attacks, Rigger retreated strategically, using the debris from the destroyed base as cover to buy himself a few seconds to think. He was weaker than the troll but faster and more skilled. If the fight continued, It would only drag on unless he found a decisive solution, something to break through the troll's defenses without exhausting himself completely. That's when an idea struck him, a technique inspired by one of his favorite characters, Ryujin, specifically Yamamoto's Zanka no Tachi, East, where extreme heat was concentrated at the tip of the sword. He didn't need to replicate the technique perfectly. A functional version would suffice. After all, his sword had already cut about 2 centimeters through the black energy before. Piercing a few more centimeters into the troll's chest didn't seem impossible. If I can concentrate all the flames at the tip, I can destroy him from the inside in one strike. Rigger thought as he dodged another brutal blow that split a stone pillar in two. The idea seemed solid. Execution would be the real test. The combat grew fiercer. Rigger moved with speed and precision, while River Kinkard relied on brute strength and endurance. Each swing of the troll's axe shook the ground, while Rigger evaded and counterattacked with calculated movements. Yet the troll seemed to revel in the fight, as if it were just a game. Rigger began channeling his magic. The blade of his blue sword, always engulfed in flames, started to glow with even greater intensity. The golden flames turned blue, then began to shift to a purplish hue at the tip of the blade. He was transferring all the heat and energy to a single point, turning the sword into a weapon of concentrated destruction. River noticed the change but showed no concern. Instead, he roared and attacked with even more ferocity. In a swift move, Rigger dodged a downward swing of the axe, which created a crater in the ground, and seized his chance. Spinning into position at a perfect angle, he delivered a precise strike to the troll's chest. The blade pierced through the enemy's weakened, melted armor and struck the dark shield that formed once more to protect the impact point. This time, however, the barrier wasn't enough. The extreme heat focused at the tip of the blade shattered the protection, piercing about 4 centimeters into the troll's torso. River's eyes widened in surprise as Rigger gave one final push with all his strength. Before the troll could react, Rigger unleashed the accumulated energy in his sword. An explosion of fire erupted from inside the troll's body, obliterating his torso and leaving only the left half of his body intact. Due to their height difference, the explosion was directed upward. The purple explosion lit up the night sky, creating a pillar of fire that seemed to connect Earth to the heavens. The surrounding debris was pushed away by the impact, and the heat melted parts of the remaining ice covering the base. As the dust and flames subsided, the mutilated body of the troll fell to its knees, still clutching the axe. With one final breath, River smiled, even in defeat. "Ha ha ha, if I had to die, I'm glad it was at the hands of a great warrior," he repeated before collapsing to the side, his body finally lifeless. Rigger stood silently for a moment, surveying the now destroyed battlefield cloaked in ash. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the combat and the destruction around him. "Make better choices if you live again," he murmured before sheathing his sword and heading toward an entrance to the underground. He still had work to do. The chilling mist still lingering in the air served as a silent reminder of the massacre that had just occurred. As Rigger moved across the debris-strewn terrain, his thoughts returned to Gallus. He hadn't destroyed the ice statues. The thought struck him, quickening his pace. If he's escaped... Rigger muttered to himself. That would be troublesome, or perhaps Gallus would simply flee to another country. Still, Rigger wasn't willing to take that risk. He silently prayed that Gallus was still there, trapped and unable to escape the ice that encased him. When Rigger arrived at the location where the statues stood, he exhaled a sigh of relief. They were still there. The frozen forms of the mercenaries remained motionless, their expressions twisted in pain and shock, eternally etched into the translucent ice. Gallus was among them, though his condition was different. Rigger stepped closer, narrowing his eyes to examine him more carefully. The ice encasing the advanced warriors was complete, penetrating deep into their bodies. Rigger could sense no trace of life within them. However, Gallus, with his robust Tuki, had resisted more than the others. The ice had not penetrated as deeply, leaving him partially frozen but still immobilized. His wide eyes reflected the terror and agony of someone who had endured indescribable torment. Rigger recognized this as a truly terrible way to die. In such a situation, being weaker might have been better, as death would have come instantly. "This ends here," he murmured, raising his hand. A sharp gust of wind surged from his palm, obliterating the ice statues in an instant. Shards glittered in the air like crystalline rain, dissolving into the blood-stained ground. With that done, Rigger climbed atop a mound of rubble and surveyed the entire complex. He closed his eyes and activated his mana vision, allowing energy to flow into his field of view. Every corner of the structure was analyzed, his senses attuned to any signs of life. There was no one left on the surface. All enemies who hadn't fled were dead. Unfortunately, even the servants and slaves in the upper levels had succumbed to the chaos. Still, Rigger detected movement below ground. The underground area teemed with activity, mana signatures pulsing with desperation or confusion. He closed his eyes again, deactivating his mana vision, and took a deep breath. There was still more to be done. With firm steps, Rigger left the ruins to meet his group, who awaited him outside. The sight he encountered brought a mix of relief and concern. Scattered around them were bodies, evidence that the battle had extended there. At the center, Yen lay wounded and unconscious on the ground. Rigger paused for a moment, realizing he had completely forgotten about Yen, whom he had ordered to attack the base with him. "Idar, were there any complications?" he asked. Idar, breathing heavily, nodded. 2 advanced warriors showed up. The Doldia warriors, and I managed to handle them together. Rigger turned to Rufus, who was staring at the lifeless bodies on the ground, but seemed unharmed. "And you, little one, how are you?" "I'm fine," Rufus replied. Rigger's gaze fell on Yen, whose breathing was irregular. Kneeling beside him, Rigger quickly examined his injuries before raising his hands to cast a healing spell. Luminous energy enveloped Yan's body, gradually closing his wounds. Once finished, Rigger stood and looked at Idar with a grave expression. "How did he survive? I froze the entire base. I thought no one could escape." Idar ran a hand through his hair. He managed to infiltrate, killing 3 people by pretending to be an ally. But when they discovered him, an advanced warrior chased him down. He barely escaped with his life. Rigger studied him for a moment, assessing his words. He knew Yen wasn't particularly skilled, which made the extraordinary luck that had kept him alive all the more evident. "He's incredibly lucky. I really had forgotten about him," Rigger said, a shadow of a smile crossing his lips before turning to the rest of the group. "Okay, let's free the slaves. Let him recover here." Rigger's statement was met with resolute nods. Despite their evident exhaustion, a glimmer of determination shone in everyone's eyes. They knew the fight wasn't over just because their enemies were dead. As they prepared to re-enter the building, Rigger cast a glance over the battlefield around him. The weight of his actions hit him like a wave. He knew that day would be remembered, both by the people they saved and by the enemies they made. Moving forward, he led the group back into the building. The slave rescue would now begin. The group approached one of the entrances to the underground area, where a heavy, frozen, reinforced wooden door blocked their path. Rigger raised his hand and conjured a powerful gust of wind. The cutting blast shattered the ice instantly, scattering gleaming fragments into the air. One of the group's warriors stepped forward and pushed the door open with a loud creak, revealing a staircase descending deep into the earth. Rigger led the way for a moment, carefully observing each step before abruptly stopping. He turned to the group and spoke in a firm yet controlled tone. "There are 4 guards lying in wait to ambush us ahead. They aren't strong. You handle them." Idar and the Doldia warriors nodded promptly, stepping ahead without hesitation. Rigger glanced around before crouching down to pick up Rufus. The 4-year-old looked at him curiously, sensing his mentor's reflective tone. "What do you think of this mission?" Rigger asked as they descended, his voice softer this time. Rufus tilted his head, pondering for a moment before replying, "I think it's cruel." Rigger smiled faintly, nodding in agreement. "You're right. It is cruel. Many things in life are like that. Sometimes you have to choose, weighing the benefits." He paused, looking at Rufus seriously. "I don't want you to think that the Iron Legion is an ally of justice. To some people, we'll be exactly the opposite. We just protect our own and fight our enemies. There will always be differences in opinion between people, perhaps even within the Legion itself. And that's when strength makes the difference." Rufus remained thoughtful as Rigger paused. Then he continued, "I want you to keep this in mind during your training. I'll teach you to be strong, and you'll always use that strength to defend your own justice. There will be moments of doubt, and when they come, you can always ask me anything." The child nodded slowly, absorbing his mentor's words as the sounds of battle echoed ahead. Within minutes, the group caught up with the others. The 4 guards who had planned the ambush lay sprawled on the ground, their bodies motionless. Idar and the warriors were unharmed. They continued descending until they emerged into a vast underground chamber. The sight was striking in its immensity, lit by torches mounted on the walls. Metal cages lined the space, forming endless rows housing hundreds of slaves. The conditions were horrific. Many were malnourished, some already in critical condition. Various races were present, but most were humans and members of beast folk, with some demons scattered among them. Rigger looked up at the ceiling. It was full of cracks, with some stones already fallen to the ground. The entire structure seemed on the verge of collapse. He walked slowly down the main corridor, his gaze somber as he surveyed the scene. "Start freeing everyone," he ordered. The others immediately dispersed, forcing the cages open and helping the slaves out. Many were too weak to walk on their own. Some initially resisted, scared or distrustful, but Rigger's calm presence and the others' efforts eventually convinced most to cooperate. Rigger, in turn, focused on healing those on the brink of death. With his hands enveloped in luminous energy, he moved from person to person, restoring just enough vitality for them to move. Unfortunately, not everyone survived. In some cells, lifeless bodies were piled up, and the pain on the survivors' faces was a stark reminder of the horrors they'd endured. Finally, after long minutes of work, the group managed to gather all the slaves on the surface. The sight awaiting them was striking. The complex, once an imposing fortress, was now a frozen landscape, with structures covered in ice and stalactites glistening under the first light of dawn. Many of the freed slaves stood in awe, unable to fully process the scene before them. Rigger remained silent, observing the expressions of shock and relief around him. He knew this was just the beginning. Freeing the slaves was a victory, but now they needed a path forward. Rigger stepped into the center of the group of newly freed slaves, his relatively small figure standing tall on a stone platform he created, drawing the confused and fearful gazes of dozens toward him. The chill still emanating from the surrounding ice heightened the atmosphere of tension and uncertainty. He took a deep breath, projecting his voice firmly but without aggression. "You are free now." His declaration echoed across the open space, reverberating among the nearby trees and the frozen walls of the destroyed complex. Some slaves exchanged glances, as if they couldn't believe what they'd just heard. "I don't know where you all come from, whether you became slaves voluntarily, were sold or attacked, nor do I care. I saved you primarily because of those of my own race. But I know that many of you have no place to return to, some younger ones don't even know a trade to live by." Rigger paused, his gaze sweeping over the tired faces marked by pain. "I'm offering you a choice. You can join us, become part of the Iron Legion. You'll work alongside us, fight alongside us, for your lives and for the lives of others like you. If you decide to stay, you'll have security and support. I won't promise an easy path, but you'll have a chance to make a difference. The Iron Legion isn't an alliance of justice. We don't fight for an absolute ideal, but for ourselves and those who choose to stand with us. We are the shield and blade for those who trust in our strength, but that doesn't mean we are free from mistakes or judgment. What matters is that we walk with purpose, determined to bear the weight of our choices." Some expressions shifted to curiosity, while others remained skeptical. He continued, "If you don't want to stay, no one will force you. You're free to follow your own path, return to your homes. But always remember this debt, and if we ever need your help for any reason in the future, I hope for your cooperation. The choice is yours." There was a heavy silence after his words, broken only by the sound of the wind rustling through frozen branches and hesitant murmurs among the slaves. Most of the beast folk had already made their decisions, but the other races remained hesitant. A human man stepped forward. He looked slightly stronger than the others, but his body was still marked with deep scars. "Will you give privileges to your own race? I have nothing left, and I'd likely become a mercenary after this. But if you tell me your organization will be based on merit and not race, I'll give it a chance." Rigger looked directly at him, surprised by the man's perspective. "I don't discriminate against any race. Everyone is welcome, and everyone has equal opportunities. Of course, those who join earlier will have more chances to prove themselves. I'll give you all time to think it over." The man hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. Others began murmuring among themselves, and gradually more figures started stepping forward. Turning around, Rigger saw 10 individuals from the beastfolk race approaching. He greeted them warmly and then turned to the 2 Doldia warriors accompanying him. He noticed their emotional expressions as they looked at 2 of the newly freed captives. "Do you know them?" Rigger asked, curiosity evident in his voice. One of the warriors, a man with brown hair and deep-set eyes, responded with a trembling voice, "Yes, they're from our tribe. We thought they were dead. They were captured years ago." He swallowed hard, clearly struggling to contain his emotions. Rigger nodded, understanding the weight of the moment. Then he continued, "I'll need your help. Take these 10 to the underground chamber. There's a room where the organization hid its treasures. It's too much for just the 2 of you to carry, so take them along. Your mission is to retrieve everything you can and bring it to the surface." The 2 warriors nodded immediately, now filled with renewed energy. They turned and began leading the 10 volunteers toward the underground chamber. Rigger watched them disappear into the entrance before turning his attention back to the remaining slaves. He also made his way to the battlefield, retrieving weapons and valuables, including the black troll's axe and a black gem embedded in the troll's chest. It appeared to be part of the creature's body. He theorized that it might be the source of the troll's dark energy and decided to take it for further investigation. Rigger gave the slaves time to decide their fates. Many were still confused, discussing in small groups, some with teary eyes as they pondered the young warrior's words. Meanwhile, the Doldia warriors returned from the underground chamber, carrying everything of value they could find: sacks of gold, jewelry, and high-quality weapons. Some beastfolk who had joined Rigger helped carry heavy chests. Rigger observed silently as the group reorganized. Once the final load was brought out, he approached the entrance to the underground chamber. His expression hardened, and his heart raced. "Everyone, step back at least 100 meters, he commanded, his firm voice cutting through the murmurs. The warriors, slaves, and even Idar retreated, forming a wide circle around him. Rigger drew his sword in a slow, deliberate motion. Its blade shimmered in the icy light around them but was soon engulfed in flames. At first, the fire was a timid flicker, but it quickly grew, fueled by his magic. He intertwined compressed wind, amplifying the flame's intensity. The fire roared now, burning in shades of orange, red, and finally violet. The temperature skyrocketed. Rigger could feel his skin burning from the heat radiating off the blade, but his gaze remained fixed on the frozen base before him. He murmured to himself, justifying what he was about to do. Killing 2 saints was a statement. But I don't know if it's enough to deter the more powerful organizations. And it's certainly not enough for melees. They need proof. Something they can't ignore. Something to show that I am not someone to be trifled with. As he continued gathering fire into his sword, Rigger sharpened his senses. He wanted to ensure there were no innocent lives in the direction of the impending destruction. His perception confirmed. No villages, no nearby life. Just a vast forest with animals and a few monsters. The wind around him began to spiral violently, driven by his magic. Everything nearby started to melt. The ice, the stones, even the ground seemed to dissolve. The heat was unbearable, but Rigger's supernatural resilience healed his burns as he fed more power into the growing inferno on his blade. The violet fire reached an intensity he had never seen before. His blue sword seemed alive, pulsating with the accumulated energy. He knew this was the most powerful spell he had ever cast, a strike not just of destruction but of declaration. "Hellish Slash," he whispered, naming the move as he pulled the sword back. With a devastating swing, he unleashed the blade's power. The world seemed to freeze for a moment before a wave of violet fire consumed the slaver's base. The explosion was deafening, a surge of heat so intense that even those far away felt their lungs burn from the scorched air. The base and its underground chamber were obliterated in seconds, reduced to ash. The devastation didn't stop there. The forest behind the base was engulfed in flames, a voracious wave of fire consuming everything in its path. The impact was so powerful that the ground trembled, and the sky was lit by a purple glow that rivaled the sun. As the smoke and echoes of destruction began to fade, Rigger stood still, staring at the scene before him. The blast's radius could have destroyed a city 5 times over. A smoldering, fiery void replaced the former complex. The distant forest was gone, with a few lingering flames still spreading. He looked up at the sky, noticing rain clouds gathering, and decided to let the rain extinguish the remaining fires. Slowly, he turned to face the group behind him. Their expressions were a mix of fear, admiration, and shock. Many were speechless, unable to find words for what they had just witnessed. Idar was the first to approach, his expression serious but respectful. Before he could speak, Rigger said, "I'll help the others." His voice was calm but carried unyielding determination. He looked at the slaves and added, "Let them make their choices. Those who wish to join us, take them to the city." Without waiting for a response, he turned and ran toward the city, the violet light of his flames still burning in his memory. The proof he left behind was not just an act of destruction, it was a warning. One he hoped he would never have to use again. The city buzzed with unusual commotion, even though the sun had just risen. The hurried footsteps of guards echoed through the streets as civilians watched from a distance, murmuring among themselves. Nights in Zant were typically quiet, but today, tension was everywhere. Rigger moved across the rooftops. He didn't need to listen to understand that news of the attacks on the bases had spread. Combined with the large explosion outside the city, it had caused fear and concern, leaving Zant on high alert. His eyes quickly scanned his surroundings, searching for signs of the two groups led by Taze and Kidder, who were supposed to be completing their missions. After a few minutes, he heard familiar sounds from one of the main streets. It was Taze's group. He quickened his pace, moving like a blur until he positioned himself on a nearby rooftop, from where he could observe everything clearly. Taze led the group with authority, followed by a crowd of freed people. Some of the slaves, tears streaming down their faces, knelt at the warriors' feet, offering their profound gratitude. Others, quieter, stayed with the group, hesitating to part from their rescuers. Rigger watched as Taze organized the freed individuals into small groups before guiding them to a safe location. He didn't approach. He didn't lead the Iron Legion alone and needed them to handle this on their own. Instead, he turned and set out to find Kidder's group. It didn't take long to locate them. They were heading toward the outskirts of the city, their group slightly smaller but just as efficient. Kidder also seemed to have completed his mission without significant problems, with the freed slaves being guided in an orderly line by his comrades. Rigger counted silently, satisfied to see that the number of rescued individuals was significant. He stayed hidden, as before, merely a shadow observing from the darkness. The mission was nearly complete, but there was still one more thing to do. The Lord's mansion in Zant was a monument to opulence, illuminated even at night. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, and the movement at the gates reflected the unrest brought on by the recent events. Rigger approached silently, scaling the outer walls until he reached a vantage point where he could see the main courtyard clearly. That's when he spotted him, the Lord of Zant, hurrying out of the mansion. His expression was a mix of fear and anger, his eyes focused on something distant on the horizon. The sky still bore remnants of the flames and glow that marked the attack on the base. Surrounded by a dozen guards, the Lord appeared to be giving orders, but Rigger didn't care about his words. He jumped from the shadows, appearing in the courtyard as an imposing figure, his presence overwhelming. "I advise you not to get involved." His voice cut through the air like a blade, carrying an intensity that made even the most seasoned soldier step back. The bloodlust emanating from Rigger was suffocating, a reflection of the accumulated fury from the night's events. The Lord stumbled backward, nearly falling, as he stared at Rigger with wide eyes. What do you want?" Rigger stepped forward, and the guards, frozen, didn't move to protect their master. "Tomorrow, we will leave this city with a large number of freed slaves. If you wish to avoid the fate of the traffickers, return to your mansion and pretend you saw nothing." Before the Lord could respond, Rigger vanished. One moment he was in front of him, the next only a sharp wind remained, leaving a superficial cut on the Lord's throat. The man clutched his neck as blood trickled lightly, his body trembling. The guards looked around desperately, but Rigger was already gone, like a shadow that had never been there. As the lights of the mansion faded behind him, Rigger made his way through the deserted streets toward the tavern. The tavern buzzed with activity, though the atmosphere carried a palpable tension. People came and went, some carrying crates of supplies, others delivering hurried messages. At the center of it all, Pycax stood at a table covered in papers and lists, orchestrating the commotion like a conductor leading a chaotic orchestra. Rigger was thoroughly impressed. This man was truly efficient. No. The wheat goes straight to the tavern's kitchen, not the warehouse. And you, he turned to another group. Bring me the receipts. If I can't keep track of the expenses, we'll be bankrupt before we even get started. In the middle of his rant, a shadow appeared beside him. I see the preparations are going well. Paikak jumped, knocking the papers off the table and clutching his chest. Could you stop appearing out of nowhere? I'm too old for these surprises. Rigger smiled, crossing his arms. Sorry, but I don't waste time with introductions. He glanced at the scattered papers. You seem busy. Of course I am. Paikak huffed, quickly gathering the papers. I've already spoken with the main suppliers. They can provide everything you need, but as I said, it's last minute. This will cost a fortune. He shot Rigger a pointed look. Do you have the money to pay for this? Rigger nodded confidently. I do. Prepare enough supplies for 300 to 400 people. He estimated this number based on the freed slaves and how many he expected to join the Iron Legion. Many would have places to return to, but a significant number would likely stay with them. Paikak's eyes widened, nearly dropping the papers again. 300 to 400. Are you insane? What are you going to do with so many people? Before Paikak could continue, Rigger raised a hand to interrupt. He leaned slightly forward, continuing, I suggest you warn your merchant friends that there will be a significant increase in demand for travel supplies. Many people will be looking for work or leaving the city soon. Paikak blinked, processing his words. He began connecting the dots, the explosion at the slavers' base, the city's current unrest, and now an influx of new members to the Legion. A bead of sweat rolled down his forehead as the bigger picture became clearer. Seeing Paikak's discomfort, Rigger gave an enigmatic smile. Besides that, Paikak, I have an invitation for you. Paikak raised an eyebrow, intrigued. An invitation? I want you to join the Iron Legion. The surprise on Paikak's face was evident. Me? Exactly. You would be our logistics manager. Before you respond, I suggest you investigate and understand what we accomplished tonight. But this is just the beginning. We're going much further. Paikak seemed torn between shock and curiosity. I extended this invitation because, from what I understand, you value interests above all else, Rigger continued. Think carefully. At 50 years old, you still have the chance to achieve something great. This is your opportunity to be part of something bigger. Paikak opened his mouth to respond, but Rigger raised his hand again. I'll only make this offer once. Consider it carefully. Before he could say anything else, Rigger disappeared into thin air, leaving only the rustling sound of papers falling to the ground. Paikak stood still, confused and stunned, his hands instinctively clutching the papers. Rigger's words echoed in his mind as he struggled to process the unexpected proposal. Outside Zant, a clearing bustled with activity, resembling an improvised small village. Tents lined the area, filled with people engaged in various tasks. The air was rich with the smell of fresh food as makeshift cooks stirred large pots over open fires. Healers used magic on injured and weakened ex-slaves, while others trained with rudimentary weapons. Wagons laden with supplies were parked near the forest, and the clanging of hammers and tools echoed as workers prepared for a long journey. Bringing everyone into the city for a day would have been wasteful, and here they could learn how to set up camp more securely. Inside a large central tent, Rigger was meeting with Taze, Kidder, and Joseph, the human mercenary who had spoken to him the previous day. Although Joseph still seemed somewhat out of place among the Legion's warriors, he had already earned a degree of trust with his straightforward demeanor and efficient reports. Taze began his report. Boss, we had some delays, but everything will be ready for departure tomorrow. He glanced at the sheet in his hands. There's still one issue to resolve. One of the bases I attacked had a large number of animals and monsters in captivity. What should we do with them? Rigger crossed his arms, considering the matter. Kill the adult monsters and sell the adult and young animals. As for the monster cubs, are there any noteworthy ones? Taze quickly scanned his notes before replying. Yes, there are 3 ebony wolf cubs that survived. They're cubs now, but when fully grown, they become rank A monsters. Rigger smiled, clearly pleased with the news. Excellent. Bring one to me. I'll try to raise it. Keep one for yourself, and the third. Kidder, you take care of it. Kidder folded his arms and shook his head. Sorry, but I don't want to take care of any monster. Then give the third to Rufus. He'll appreciate it, Rigger replied without hesitation. Our goal is to tame them. Additionally, encourage others to choose monster cubs to raise. For those left unclaimed, either kill them or use them as food for the ones that are. Rigger's gaze shifted as he reflected. The history books Verdia had shown me described how people tamed monsters as allies in ancient times. I've always kept that idea in mind, but other priorities have kept me from pursuing it. Now that the opportunity has presented itself, I won't let it slip away. If this works, the Iron Legion could take our vision even further in the future. Taze nodded, though he still found the idea of taming monsters a bit strange. Kidder seized the moment to continue his report. As for final numbers, 450 have decided to join us. Rigger raised an eyebrow in surprise. 450? That's more than I expected. Kidder gave a faint smile and elaborated. Many were impressed and inspired by the display of power you gave. Rigger contemplated this. It helps create a temporary sense of unity. Even without a clear chain of command, at least they have an absolute leader to follow. Of course, this will only work as long as I remain overwhelmingly stronger, which I plan to be for a long time. He nodded, seeing the logic. This will be useful until we fully establish the hierarchy. Kidder continued, we've already begun the screening process you suggested, dividing everyone into the divisions you created: training and education, internal control and security, commerce and diplomacy, exploration and reconnaissance, medicine and alchemy, communication and intelligence, administration and human resources, research and development, logistics and support, and combat and tactical operations. But it'll take a few days to finish. We're assessing their skills and figuring out where they fit, as you instructed. Kidder let out a sigh. But it's confusing, and most of them have no idea what their roles will entail. Is Killian applying the same system in the Great Forest? Because even I don't know what some of these divisions are supposed to do. Taze couldn't suppress a laugh, which drew a faint smile from Rigger. It doesn't matter if they don't understand for now, just call them first, second, third, etc., to simplify things, Rigger replied. I'll explain gradually during the journey what each division is responsible for. And yes, Killian is implementing the same system in the Great Forest. He then turned his attention to Joseph, who was waiting to speak. The human began as soon as Rigger looked at him. All the children without parents or guardians chose to stay. That's the majority of them. I spoke with Pycak and managed to integrate most of the freed slaves into temporary jobs. They planned to save some money and then travel to their homes. Many decided to travel with us for safety. Joseph paused briefly before concluding, we're finalizing the last details now. Everything should be ready by nightfall. Rigger nodded, satisfied with the progress. Looking at Taze, he asked, what about the Lord? Any movement? Taze shook his head. After some guards investigated the traffickers' base ruins and made their reports, he hasn't left his mansion. Rigger smiled. Good. We'll leave at dawn. At that moment, a warrior entered the tent with a message. Boss, Pycak is here. He wants to see you. Rigger gestured with his hand. Let him in. Pycak entered with firm steps, his posture brimming with pride. He crossed his arms and looked directly at Rigger. I accept your proposal. Rigger grinned broadly, clearly pleased. He glanced at the others in the tent and made an enthusiastic announcement. Meet our new commander of logistics and support. The others exchanged surprised looks as Pycak tried to maintain his composure under the sudden attention. Rigger, however, seemed more than satisfied with the decision. It had been a few days since they had left Port Zant. The sun rose on the horizon as the first rays touched the damp earth, awakening the city. A faint mist still lingered in the air, rendering the landscape ethereal, as if nature itself wished to prolong the peaceful silence of dawn. Slowly, the Iron Legion's camp came to life. Warriors and group members moved with precision, dismantling the last tents, loading carts with supplies, and adjusting the horses' saddles. At the center of it all, an open space had been chosen for the morning training. The rhythmic sound of wooden swords meeting water echoed in the distance. Rigger stood facing Idar, his body relaxed but his eyes sharp. Both wielded wooden swords, practicing the water god style, their postures fluid and graceful, like the movement of a river. Rigger's focus was clear, to master the flow. The flow is akin to the long sword of light of the sword god style, Once fully mastered, one becomes a water saint. But even knowing how to use it was the key to being considered a truly advanced level warrior in the water god style. He had already learned all the necessary techniques, but he needed to apply them flawlessly. One mistake and the flow would break, and the technique would fail. "Control your haste, Rigger," said Idar calmly, pausing momentarily and assuming his fluid posture. "If your body and mind are not in sync, the flow will never come, and you are too hasty." Rigger nodded, closing his eyes for a moment. He took a deep breath, concentrating. The sound of footsteps, voices, and horses in the distance seemed to fade. His mind focused only on the movement. When he opened his eyes again, he struck. Their wooden swords clashed, but Rigger didn't stop. He continued the movement with a spin, gracefully dodging Idar's counterattack. His sword followed like a current of water, flowing from defense to attack and back to its original position without breaking rhythm. It was an agile and graceful dance. But it wasn't perfect. "You're almost there," Idar praised. "You have as much talent as I do in this style, perhaps a little more. But you still feel the need to force the movement. Flow is natural, it's letting the sword decide the path, not you." Rigger paused and observed Idar assume the posture once more. The 15-year-old youth didn't hide the confidence in his movements. He was on the verge of mastering the flow completely, and when he did, he would be recognized as a water saint-level warrior. An impressive feat for his age. He had been a bit shaken when he first met Rigger, questioning whether he was truly talented. When he asked Idar about it, Idar simply told him that he was a monster, and that he shouldn't compare himself to monsters. Rigger smiled faintly. Indeed, Idar could be considered talented if he was close to reaching the saint level. He just needed a push. "You're really talented, Idar. I also have some talent for it, but I'm not focusing on it as much as I should. Anyway, counterattacks and techniques to cut through magic are too useful for me to abandon." Idar laughed, relaxing his stance and resting the wooden sword on his shoulder. "You're a monster, Rigger. If you wanted to, you could surpass me in this style in no time." Rigger shrugged and averted his gaze, noticing another scene not far away. Rufus sat on the ground, his brows furrowed in concentration as he murmured the words of a chant. Beside him, two brown wolf pups rolled on the ground, playing and nibbling at each other. The fear they had shown in recent days seemed to have vanished, replaced by the pure, childlike joy that only someone like Rufus could inspire. After being fed, cared for, and most importantly, welcomed, the pups had finally calmed down. Rigger decided to name them after the legendary wolves, but there already seemed to be a Fenrir in this world, so he named his wolf Skull, Rufus Jerry, and Taze Frecky. Rufus noticed Rigger's gaze and smiled, jumping to his feet and stretching his arms wide as if showing off a treasure. "Chief, I finished memorizing the chant." Rigger approached, leaving his sword aside and observing the small boy carefully. Next to them, the wolves momentarily quieted, as if they knew something important was about to happen. "Ready?" Rigger asked with an encouraging smile. Rufus nodded vigorously. "Yes, I'm ready." He turned to a thin tree, raised his hand, and took a deep breath. His voice came out clear and firm, filled with determination. "Let the earth's solidity manifest and answer my call. I summon a rock, swift and true, here and now. Stone bullet." At that instant, a small stone formed in the palm of his hand and shot toward the tree. The stone bullet flew fast and true, striking the trunk and shattering it with a dry crack. The thin and fragile tree wavered for a moment before falling. Rufus froze for a second, eyes wide. Then he let out a shout of joy and began jumping around, celebrating as if he had won the greatest battle of his life. "I did it! I did it!" he shouted, running circles around the fallen tree. Rigger smiled broadly, satisfied. "Very good, Rufus. Now that you managed to cast it with a chant, I want you to try to replicate the feeling and cast it without it." Rufus stopped jumping and looked at Rigger. "Okay." Rufus had always seen them using magic without chants, so Rigger hadn't told him it was a rare skill, thinking the challenge would be easier if the boy simply believed it was possible. Without hesitation, Rufus focused again. Perhaps because he had never doubted the possibility, or maybe due to a natural talent, he closed his eyes, extended his hand once more, and took a deep breath. A moment later, a small stone bullet formed in his palm and shot forward, though less powerful than the first. Rufus opened his eyes, widening them in surprise. I did it. I did it again. This time, he looked at Rigger with almost indescribable joy. Rigger nodded, placing a hand on the boy's head. Well done, Rufus. Always remember what I told you. Don't teach magic to anyone without my permission. Don't hurt anyone without my permission. And always use up your mana every day. That will ensure you keep growing strong. Rufus smiled broadly, his face glowing with confidence and happiness. He nodded vigorously before running off toward Idar to show what he had done. From afar, Rigger watched the small boy, feeling a slight warmth in his chest. He truly saw himself in the child. He believed he would have turned out like Rufus if he hadn't been a reincarnate. He looked around and saw Kidder approaching, wearing a serious yet calm expression. We're ready to leave, Chief. Rigger looked at Kidder with a faint smile, accepting his suggestion. Let's go then. It'll be a long journey. He cast a thoughtful gaze at those accompanying him. Tinaver, a city near Malishan, the capital of Meles, was their destination. He knew Verdia had a wealthy friend in the city and had lived with her for some time. Now they planned to use her help to secure a base in that location, a unique opportunity perhaps. Rigger looked at the horizon as the group prepared to depart. Over the coming months, he would need to instill in everyone the future workings of the Iron Legion. He needed to be ready for the challenges ahead, which involved training, coordination, and of course building bonds within the group. The journey to Tinaver wouldn't be difficult. The Holy Sword Road, famous for being safe, cut through the lands and was far from the usual monster attacks. He felt relieved by this, but at the same time, curious. That road, what had made it so different from the others? Was it truly carved by human hands? He couldn't help but be impressed by the idea. If so, it would be incredible. As the group marched, Rigger observed his companions. Up ahead, Taze was in lively conversation with some of the former Beast People slaves, including a Beast Girl. If he remembered correctly, in a few months, the mating season would start again. Just thinking about it made Rigger feel an exhaustion building. Beast Girls. They always brought that subject up, and with it came arguments, tensions, and often, a mental burden for him. The instinctive nature of his new body and the difficulty of balancing it with his human thoughts made him avoid such relationships, but he couldn't avoid it forever. He sighed, looking ahead once more, trying to focus on the path before him. More important than that was the future of the Iron Legion. Establishing a base would be the next step, and time was passing far too quickly. The convoy began to move along the road, the creaking sound of the wagons echoing as their wheels rolled over the packed earth. The sun stood high in the sky, and the landscape around the sacred sword road was peacefully beautiful. Rigger settled himself onto one of the wagons, sitting cross-legged as the gentle movement of the vehicle seemed to invite him to relax. He glanced back and then heard Pykak's voice, loud and clear, shouting something he couldn't quite make out. The sound was distant, but the force of Pykak's words remained evident. Rigger smiled, appreciating the man's unyielding spirit. He sighed again, his thoughts drifting away from the group's voices and focusing instead on his own mind, where a storm of thoughts mingled. Although they were moving, with their destination of Tinaver still months away, Rigger felt the weight of his responsibilities growing heavier with each passing moment. His savings were still considerable. After all, they had looted the treasure of an entire network of slave traffickers, one of the richest on the continent, and the money they had recovered was enough to secure a good amount of resources for his legion. But he knew what that meant. Those resources wouldn't last forever, and soon, they would need to find a sustainable way to keep the legion running. A pragmatic, but necessary, realization. He reflected on what he had discussed with the key leaders of the Iron Legion. Decisions had been made. The future of the Legion would be built not just with swords and magic, but with actions that ensured its financial stability. Part of the members would become adventurers, traveling across the continent in search of contracts to earn resources. Others would join the Legion's mercenary group, protecting villages and towns, and taking on missions for clients. But it wouldn't end there. Other members of the Legion would spread out into businesses, small enterprises they would start and sustain over time. The former slaves possessed various valuable skills, and Pykak, always pragmatic and clever, had offered some excellent ideas on how to utilize them. Once again, Rigger felt grateful for bringing Pykak along. Over the past days, the man had proven to be more than just a simple tavern keeper, offering creative solutions and organizing the Legion's operations in ways Rigger could never have imagined on his own. It was good to have someone he could trust, someone who thought about the future and the logistics of everything they were doing. Looking at the scenery before him, Rigger thought about the people of the Legion, the members who had fought by his side and who now, with the Legion's growth, would need to learn to live more organized lives, work together, and build something lasting. As the convoy moved along the peaceful road, Rigger's thoughts also drifted elsewhere. He looked around, observing the Legion's members, and his mind naturally turned toward others in distant places. How were Killian, Persina, and the others doing in the Great Forest? Rigger always worried about everyone's training, but he knew that those who were farther away, like his friends in the forest, ran the risk of neglecting their training. He sighed again. If there was one thing that always irritated him, it was when someone, especially those two heirs, fled from training whenever the opportunity arose. They, more than anyone, needed to focus on perfecting their abilities. But this also made him reflect on his own situation. He hadn't neglected his own training and knew that, for the Legion to grow and prosper, he needed to become even stronger. Training would never be enough. It would never be easy. He also thought about how his parents were doing. He worried about them, but even more so about his master. The few months he had spent away from her had been harder than he had expected. A quiet longing gripped his heart, something he tried to hide under the facade of the Legion's leader. He needed to send them a letter once they reached Tinaver, sharing news about his journey and the Legion's future. He also knew he had to tell them about Ghislaine, what had happened to her, and how she was doing. He wasn't sure how they would react, but he felt no need to hide it. Rigger made a mental list of his goals for when they reached Tinaver. Establishing and organizing the Iron Legion effectively was, undoubtedly, the most important task. But there were other things that needed to be done. He had to buy back Idar's brother from the Lord of Tinaver, or alternatively, kidnap him if circumstances turned favorable. He also knew that the opportunity to approach other territories might arise, and at some point, he needed to find a way to reach the rank of Sword King. Furthermore, he needed to travel to the dwarves' territory and embed a magic stone into his sword. His master had said that doing so would instantly increase his strength, as all of his magic would be amplified to some degree, depending on the magic stone. Beyond all this, there was another darker, more personal goal. He needed to investigate the Joylore house and, when the opportunity arose, assassinate Linstar Joylore. The reason was crystal clear in his mind. Linstar had attempted to kill his master, and Rigger couldn't let that go unpunished. He also knew that, depending on the situation, greater retaliation against the entire Joylore house might be necessary. But he also had to tread carefully. It wasn't yet the right time to become a direct enemy of Mealy's. Not yet. He wasn't strong enough, and he knew it. The convoy pressed forward on its journey, and Rigger felt the weight of his own thoughts piling up. Yet, while the others continued their conversations and tasks, he forced himself to focus on the present. He looked around, observing the people with him, and noticed something curious. Most of the gazes he met were respectful and reverent. Few showed fear. He realized that, over the past days, his frequent interactions with the Legion's members had shown them that he was more approachable than he seemed. The gazes that might once have been filled with distrust were now laced with trust. He had become someone they could rely on, not a distant leader, but someone flesh and blood who shared the same struggles and difficulties. He decided to try to learn lightning magic again. He attempted to create a small cumulonimbus cloud in his hand, as he had done on previous occasions. He concentrated, feeling the magic flow through him, and to his surprise, the cloud formed. A moment later, a small lightning bolt crackled within it. A satisfied smile crossed his lips. Finally, he managed to create the first lightning. He looked forward once more, feeling that the long road ahead would hold many more obstacles. But for now, he was ready to face whatever came. Rigger walked slowly through the empty building, observing the details of the space around him. His steps echoed through the imposing rooms, filled with dust but with sturdy structures still well preserved. He stopped in the middle of the main hall, a spacious area that could easily be turned into a large meeting point. The tall windows allowed sunlight to illuminate every corner, and Rigger let a subtle smile escape. Not bad. He murmured to himself, satisfied with the place. He exited through the main door and outside, saw the vast grounds surrounding the property. The open fields and abandoned gardens needed some care, but they were also space to be used for other purposes. Near the entrance, a small but impressive figure awaited him. It was an elderly lady with purple hair, tied up in an elegant bun. She was dressed in fine clothes and a decorated hat, exuding the aura of someone who had achieved everything they wanted in life. She was Rubia, the richest person in Tinaver, a lady who commanded much of the real estate industry, restaurant chains, and tavern rentals in Tinaver. Beside her, in silence, stood Kidder, with a serious expression, as if he were the elderly woman's bodyguard. Rubia smiled warmly as Rigger approached. "Is the size enough, my young man?" she asked in a firm yet warm voice. Rigger looked again at the place and nodded. "Yes, it's very good. We also have plenty of space to build new things. Thank you for your attention." The lady chuckled softly, hiding part of her smile behind her hand. "Foo-foo. No problem, my dear. This property once belonged to a noble house here in Tinaver. They moved to the capital, and I decided to hold on to it until a good price came along. But..." She paused and smiled even more. "It also serves to pay off a favor." Rigger's heart weighed slightly as he remembered the past. Rubia was the same young woman who had been saved by Verdia, his master, many years ago. When he introduced himself as Verdia's disciple and handed her the letter, Rubia became extremely kind and eager to help. It was a precious connection. "You can send the payment to my property," Rubia continued. "I'll have someone reliable to receive it. If you need anything, just let me know, young Rigger." "I appreciate your generosity," Rigger replied with a slight nod. Rubia turned towards her luxurious carriage, where a coachman and a guard were already waiting. Before stepping in, she waved her hand delicately. "Goodbye, goodbye," she said with a smile. Once the carriage left and disappeared down the busy street, Rigger looked at Kidder, who still silently accompanied him. "Kidder, call everyone and settle them at this property. I want Pycak to organize the members into divisions and start planning new constructions. And ask the commander of the trade division to conduct a market survey here in Tinaver." Kidder gave a brief bow and nodded. "Understood. Will you be leaving, Chief?" "Yes," Rigger replied, adjusting his sword at his waist. "I'm going with Idar to rescue his brother." Kidder didn't question him and quickly departed to carry out the orders. Rigger then glanced to the side, where Idar, the promising young swordsman of the Legion, was attentively observing the property, as if already calculating what they could do there. "Idar." Rigger called. Idar immediately turned, his eyes sharp. "Let's go. We have to get your brother back from the city center." The young man nodded, and the two of them began walking together toward the bustling heart of Tinaver. During the journey, Rigger took the time to reflect on the progress of the Iron Legion. It had been almost 2 months since they left Port Zant. The trip had taken longer than expected, both due to the size of the group and the need to keep everyone organized. He had spent that time guiding, training, and assigning roles to each member of the Legion. The work had been exhausting, more tiring even than the physical training, as he had to consider all the future possibilities in his organization. They hadn't yet mastered everything they needed to, but at least they had a basic understanding of their responsibilities. The division commanders he had chosen had already taken up their roles solidly, so he no longer had to be as involved. Rigger took a deep breath as he walked, feeling a mix of fatigue and relief. Tinaver marked the beginning of a new phase. The Iron Legion was starting to strengthen, and now the focus would be on building a solid base so they could operate as a true organized force. Moreover, something else had been bothering him in recent days. The mating season was about to begin. The mere thought sent a shiver down his spine, bringing a strange anxiety he preferred to ignore. For now. "Rigger, how do you plan to talk to him exactly?" Idar asked, breaking the silence. Rigger looked at the young man and smiled slightly. "I haven't really thought about it. I'll just give him a beating if he's too expensive." Idar laughed. They continued their walk in silence, as the city of Tinaver revealed itself in all its grandeur. Bustling streets, shouting merchants, and imposing stone buildings. The noise and lively atmosphere of the city were signs that a new phase was just beginning. The good news was that, a month and a half ago, Rigger had finally learned lightning magic. Although his first attempts were still rudimentary, he could already cast a basic, straight lightning bolt. The problem, however, lay in control. After casting the spell, he lost nearly all precision, and the bolt would follow a wild, uncontrollable path. But Rigger didn't worry about that. His mastery was improving quickly, and he was constantly advancing. Now that he had mastered the basic spells he considered essential, like fire, wind, water, earth, healing, and lightning, he could finally start working on more complex projects that had been brewing in his mind. Gravity, summoning, and space-time magic were the next long-term goals. But he soon realized that the theoretical knowledge he had wasn't enough to perform these spells. The theory only helped visualize the processes, not make them a reality. Creating a lightning bolt from scratch, for example, only became possible due to practical inspiration, the cumulonimbus spell, which he had studied and replicated. Without an example, he would be limited to what he could imagine, and trial and error could take years or even decades. He remembered stories of people easily creating magic based on theoretical knowledge, but the issue was that these physical elements from his previous world weren't controlled by magic. The interaction between the natural mana of this world and these elements was the key. Of course, when you had a practical example of magic, that theoretical knowledge helped further develop your spells. The idea of invading the flying fortress and talking to the armored dragon king seems more and more feasible. Rigger murmured, frustrated with the limitations. However, he didn't let himself get discouraged. While searching for information on more advanced magic, there was still much to explore in other areas. In recent months, Rigger had begun developing elaborate ideas related to Tuki, manipulating its properties to make it faster, more resistant, or stronger. His idea was that different fighting styles shaped Tuki differently, replicating different effects. He theorized that if he could manipulate these changes instantly, he would react faster and be much more versatile than his enemies. Another thing he needed to experiment with was the black gem he had pulled from the chest of the black troll. Some demon races had strange powers derived from magical gems, but that was for the future. Combining this with barrier magic and magic circles, the potential was almost unlimited. Ironically, or not, barrier magic was the one Rigger had the least natural talent for so far, but at the same time, it was the one that gave him the most ideas for application. He had already concluded that magic circles and barriers worked similarly to programming from his old world. Both required structure, modularization, and logic. It's almost like someone is actually trying to apply that knowledge to magic, he whispered to himself as he scribbled a magic circle in the dirt with his hand, testing small effects. For a long time, he hadn't dedicated himself to this. He knew it wouldn't be a quick and straightforward study, and there were always other more efficient spells that would increase his immediate strength, something he had needed since the beginning of his life. But now, with the Legion starting to stabilize and having established a deterrent force against the Great Forest, he could invest time in the magic circles, which had much greater long-term potential. Rigger had already applied many of the concepts almost from the beginning, using modularization to break spells into smaller, more manageable parts. For example, summoning a stone cannon. Harden the bullet. Increase rotation. Add propulsion force. It was basic, but the principle was clear. Modularizing a spell into independent parts allowed for more precision and better results. However, the true potential of magic circles lay in the more advanced possibilities. Rigger began to sketch more complex applications. Automatic reactions. If I'm attacked with fire, automatically cast a fire barrier. Magic circuits in items. Create spells that activated under specific conditions, like an instant healing spell upon use, focused on specific parts of the body. These were just the simplest applications he thought of at the moment. Rigger's mind was buzzing with ideas for magic, enchanted items, and possible combinations that could revolutionize his combat style. This would go far beyond just shooting fireballs or wind blasts, he thought, excited. It's like creating magical programs that perform actions automatically. I could even replicate many technologies from Earth with this. However, he knew he would need to keep working on magical control. Mastery over mana would never be a problem. On the contrary, the more control, the better. Elemental magic still had a lot to explore too, like vacuum magic and flight magic, underwater breathing magic, earth molecular magic, nuclear magic. These first two in particular would be a gift for his master Verdia. It would be perfect if he could create enchantments for them, but if not, he would personally bring them to her. Rigger also believed that magical control would be essential to mastering advanced barrier magic. Even though it was one of his weakest spells, he was determined to use it in a way no conventional mage would even consider. If I can control the barrier with extreme precision, I could use it like Tuki, sticking it directly to my skin. By using the barrier in direct contact with his body, he could drastically increase his defense and at the same time, surprise unsuspecting enemies. After all, who would expect a barrier, usually used as static defense, to be mobile, flexible, and offensive? Rigger felt a surge of motivation flow through his body. With the Legion finally settling in Tinaver, he would have the time to experiment, fail, and perfect these new ideas. Every little advancement brings me closer to the top of the world. He murmured, closing his eyes for a moment. Idar, who had been silently walking beside him, finally glanced over, intrigued. Rigor, are you okay? You suddenly got quiet. Huh? Oh yeah, Rigor replied, snapping out of his thoughts with a smile. I was just thinking about a few things. Thinking? Like battle strategies? Idar asked, curious. Something like that, Rigor answered without going into details. Let's keep going. We still have your brother to rescue, don't we? Idar smiled, full of hope, and nodded. The two continued walking as the gears in Rigor's mind spun faster and sharper than ever. Hey, I think it'd be much better to just kidnap him, Idar suggested, breaking the silence with a firm tone. Some of the beast race will be heading to the Great Forest soon. A blacksmith is going to teach them how to forge weapons, and others are delivering letters. My brother is blind, Rigor, and he's still so young. He's only 6. I'd rather send him to live in the Great Forest with my grandmother. There he can learn something in safety. Rigor paused for a moment, processing Idar's words. His logic was simple and direct. That's true. If the Lord of Tinaver finds out we're here to buy him, he'll probably jack up the price. And if we kidnap him later, we'll be the prime suspects. So, why not just take him now? Rigor glanced over at the sprawling city ahead and smirked. All right, Idar. I'll go get him. In the meantime, post a job at the Adventurers Guild. Something like a magic instructor. The requirement will be an advanced mage proficient in all attack magics. We'll need someone to train the more common members of the Legion too. Idar smiled, satisfied. I'll leave that to you then. Sometime later, Rigor stood before the Lord of Tinaver's mansion, an imposing structure of stone and fine wood. But to him, it was far too vulnerable. This is too easy. With his mana sight activated and his keen sense of smell and hearing, Rigor moved like a shadow through corridors and windows. No guard, no servant escaped his perception. His stealth was impeccable, the result of years of training and refinement. I could also create an alarm system with barriers. My master mentioned that in Militian, they have barriers like these to protect large mansions. This has to be a priority. If I can infiltrate this easily, others can too. After combing through the halls and eavesdropping on snippets of servants' conversations, he finally found the boy. The child, with dark hair and worn clothes, stood in the middle of a grand hall, cleaning the floor with an old cloth. The way he moved, meticulously and in sections, showed that he was guided only by touch due to his blindness. Rigor paused for a moment, observing the scene. He felt some compassion or perhaps pity, but there was something about the boy, perhaps his calm or resolve, that made him hesitate briefly. I don't feel like wasting time with conversation. In one swift motion, Rigor covered the boy's mouth, preventing any scream or reaction. The boy flinched but quickly went still, likely realizing that resistance was futile. Rigor grabbed him firmly and, like a speeding shadow, escaped the mansion as easily as he had entered. Back at the new base of the Iron Legion, the activity was already bustling. Members of the Legion were carrying crates, arranging makeshift furniture, and training in small open spaces. Rigor arrived carrying the blind boy in his arms. Upon entering, he looked at one of the nearby members and ordered, "Tell Joseph to come talk to me." He gently placed the boy in a chair, then knelt in front of him, speaking firmly but without aggression. "Hey kid. I'm a friend of your brother, Idar. I came to rescue you. You'll see him soon, so just wait patiently." To Rigor's surprise, the boy didn't ask questions or struggle. He merely nodded, remaining quiet. His behavior caught Rigor's attention. He's not shaken. He didn't scream or try to run. He's probably been through worse. This calm. It's like he's used to being treated this way. For a moment, something inside Rigor stirred. A feeling of empathy. "You'll be okay soon," he murmured before standing up and leaving. Out in the makeshift training ground, Rigor observed Rufus practicing with Skoll and Jerry, the two wolves that were growing rapidly. Rufus was becoming increasingly skilled with earth magic, raising pillars and controlling projectiles with impressive precision. Noticing Rigor, Skoll trotted toward him, tongue hanging out, ready to pounce. "Chief!" Rufus shouted, stopping the wolf before it could leap. Rigger simply waved back with a faint smile. Good work, Rufus. Keep training. He then walked to the room he had designated as his office. Closing the door behind him, he dropped into his chair, feeling the weight of all his accumulated responsibilities. I'll have to deal with mealies diplomatically at some point. This looked so much easier on TV. Rigger ran a hand through his hair and smiled faintly. I'll need to prepare. The more we advance, the easier it will be to attract unwanted attention. But for now... He leaned back in his chair, satisfied with their current progress. POV, Taze Dodoldia. The wind of Tinaver blew gently through the stone streets, carrying the distant smell of active forges and goods being unloaded. Taze walked calmly along the sidewalks, his hands in his pockets and a serene expression on his face. Beside him, Lisa walked with short, almost skipping steps, her eyes sharp and observant of everything. It's so different here, don't you think? She said, with a light smile as she watched the merchants shouting their offers. Taze glanced down at her. Lisa was small for a beast girl, perhaps due to malnutrition before he rescued her, but her eyes were lively, full of an energy he couldn't ignore. It was something he increasingly liked as the days passed. That smile, which seemed out of place in the dirty and cruel world they lived in. Different enough to keep the mind distracted, Taze replied, shifting his gaze to the horizon. His calm, almost bored tone contrasted with the constant vigilance in his eyes. Even while walking, he was alert. Never let your guard down, the chief always said. They passed through a more isolated alley, where the movement dwindled. Lisa paused to watch a group of children playing with a cloth ball. For a moment, Taze allowed himself to relax, crossing his arms as he watched her. She really is small, he thought, almost smiling. That's when they appeared. Two men stepped out of the shadows, blocking their path. Their expressions were those of opportunistic predators, filthy grins plastered on their worn faces. One held an improvised club, while the other had a dagger strapped to his belt. Well, what do we have here? Said the first, his malicious gaze lingering on Lisa. Beasts wandering through isolated alleys? Did you get lost, or are you offering yourselves up? Taze said nothing. He remained still, his expression unchanging. Lisa, however, stepped back slightly, feeling the weight of the men's intentions. He could see she was scared and about to say something, but Taze raised a hand slightly, cutting her off. Just as the chief said. Taze took a deep breath, looking at the two men with no emotion. Ignorance was a blessing. The major organizations on the continent already knew of the Iron Legion. They knew enough to keep their distance, at least for now. But these small fish, as Rigger liked to call them, had no idea what they were up against. They were far too bold, or just stupid. I was in a good mood, Taze spoke for the first time, his voice almost lazy, yet laced with something cold. Let's get this over with. The first man laughed, but the sound quickly died. In an instant, Taze moved. He advanced with a speed the men hadn't expected. His right hand grasped the hilt of the small blade at his belt, and in one clean, calculated motion, he stabbed the first attacker directly in the neck. The man choked, his eyes wide, and fell without making a sound. Lisa gasped, surprised. The other man turned pale, terrified. He pulled out the dagger with trembling hands, but Taze didn't move. He simply watched him, letting the fear grow. Do you have a group? Taze asked, his voice devoid of emotion. The man opened his mouth, trying to form words while staring at his fallen companion's lifeless body. Why yes, he cried, almost sobbing. Yes. We have a group, it's just us and 3 more. Only a small group, I swear. Where? Near the abandoned market, in the back. Please, don't kill me. Taze thought for a moment. He still didn't know all the details of the city. Take us there. He turned without looking at the man lying on the ground. Lisa hesitated but followed him, still stunned by how quickly the situation had unfolded. She glanced at the man, who ran ahead eagerly. As they walked toward the market, Lisa finally asked in a low voice, "Are you going to let him go?" Taze didn't answer immediately. He just kept walking, his eyes fixed straight ahead. That depends on him. The abandoned market was a cluster of broken stalls and crumbling structures, covered in dust and cobwebs. Taze's footsteps echoed through the empty walls as Lisa followed closely, her gaze more serious now. The small group of bandits wasn't hard to find. Loud voices and laughter could be heard behind an old wooden building. Taze stopped at the entrance, observing. 5 men and 1 woman. All seated around an improvised campfire, chatting without a care in the world. 6 small cages were arranged beside them, and inside, 8 thin and filthy people stared at him in silence, their eyes full of fear and despair. Slaves. Lisa looked at Taze, waiting for his order. He drew his blade once more and smiled faintly, an empty smile, as if he were merely carrying out any other task. Wait here. Lisa nodded and stayed behind. Taze advanced alone, like a predator in the night. The group didn't notice his presence until it was too late. The first one fell with a clean strike to the nape. The others screamed, grabbing makeshift weapons, but Taze's calm and methodical expression never wavered. He moved like a shadow, blending the flexible techniques of the North God style with chantless magic, each strike precise and fatal. Within minutes, it was all over. Silence once again dominated the abandoned market, and the slaves looked at him with tears in their eyes. Taze wiped his blade on a piece of cloth and turned to Lisa, who approached slowly, her gaze fixed on him. Let's go, Taze said, beginning to unlock the cages. As they walked back to the base, the slaves following in single file, Lisa moved closer to Taze. Something in her expression had changed. She watched him with a mixture of admiration and something more. You're not just a boy, are you? Lisa whispered, her face flushed. Taze didn't reply, but a small smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. POV narrator Rigger sat at the end of the long wooden table, his sharp eyes scanning the faces in front of him. The key commanders of the Iron Legion, responsible for keeping the Tinaver branch thriving and well-managed, occupied their seats, exchanging attentive glances as the meeting progressed. The housing constructions are nearly finished, Chief, said Derek, a robust human with his arms crossed over his chest. He was the commander of the Administration and Human Resources Division. The eastern part of the base can already shelter 50 more people, and the blacksmiths managed to finish most of the tools we requested. Good, Rigger nodded, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. And what about supplies? We're well stocked until the end of winter. Some merchants here in Tinaver have shown interest in doing business with us. It seems we're starting to draw attention. We've also started your idea for livestock farming, but we have some concerns about the area where the animals are kept, as many are escaping, Pykak added, a hint of doubt in his voice. Rigger let out a quiet sigh. It was expected that nobles and merchants would begin to approach. The Legion's success wouldn't go unnoticed for long. I'll take a look and see what can be done about the stables. Nearly all the meat consumed by the population came from hunters and adventurers, since monsters were far more dangerous than common animals. He hoped to start a new trend, but it wouldn't be easy. Which merchants have reached out, he asked, looking at Launark, an elf who was the commander of the Trade and Diplomacy Division, taking notes beside him. A few, the elf replied calmly, his blue eyes focused on the paper before him. The Redwald family sent a representative to probe for potential agreements. They're prominent along the southern caravan routes. Additionally, there's a merchant named Lorien, who primarily deals in minerals and weapons. He's been quite insistent. Keep in touch, but don't commit to anything yet. Evaluate these names and find out what you can about their intentions. Understood, Chief, said Derek, bowing his head. Rigger then turned to Taze. Taze, is the eradication of hostile forces complete? Some groups fled, but they've all been dissolved in Tinaver, Taze promptly responded. The meeting continued, touching on other matters, patrol schedules, reinforcing external defenses, and even negotiations with other small mercenary groups operating in the city. Everything seemed in order, but Rigger knew appearances could be deceiving. It was then that Gorim, the dwarf commander of the Intelligence Division, cleared his throat. All eyes turned to him. Gorim was a relatively old dwarf with a long graying beard braided into strands and a sharp gaze that always seemed to see beyond the obvious. His presence carried a natural air of seriousness. Regarding that investigation the chief asked me to conduct, Gorim's deep voice filled the room. He raised a worn parchment and placed it on the table. About the Joylore house, we questioned some key figures in Tinaver and uncovered a few things. Rigger leaned in, needing as much information as possible before acting against them. Gorim leaned forward, pointing to the parchment. The Joylore house is a noble family. Decadent in theory. At least in the public eye. They maintain a facade of humility and discreet businesses, but we have reason to believe they're behind certain clandestine operations in the city, including some sacrificial rituals and slave trafficking. They're quite an extremist noble house in Mealy's. Silence fell over the room. Rigger wasn't surprised. It had to be something like this for them to become enemies of his master. Location? Strengths? He asked after a few seconds. We have the location of what we believe to be one of their main mansions, closer to the center of the capital militia, Gorham replied. It's well protected, with hired guards and a surveillance system with classic noble barriers, nearly impenetrable, which suggests a well-funded family. However, we still need a deeper investigation to be sure of what's happening inside. Rigger nodded, reflecting on the words. He felt the need to remove this thorn as soon as possible. After all, Linstar Joylor had already hired a saint to kill his master. He had to resolve it before it grew into a real threat for the Legion. All right, he said, breaking the silence. Continue the investigation, but don't alert the enemy. I want every possible detail before we take any action against the Joylor house. As you wish, Chief, Gorham replied, bowing respectfully. Rigger leaned back in his chair, relaxing for a brief moment. It was good to know things were progressing, but another issue had been on his mind for some time. He looked at Taze and Kidder. As soon as we're fully established here in Tinaver, I'll leave for a quick trip to the Dwarven territory. What? Kidder looked up from the map he was analyzing, surprised. I have plans for my sword. I need to embed it with a magic stone. Master Verdia told me several times it would greatly increase my strength, as long as it's a powerful magic stone, Rigger explained, touching the hilt of the blade at his waist. And the only ones capable of modifying one of the 49 swords are Dwarven blacksmiths. Are you going alone? Taze asked, concerned. Yes. It'll be faster that way. I won't take more than a few months. You'll all be responsible for maintaining order here while I'm away. The commanders exchanged brief glances, but no one objected. They knew that even if Rigger wasn't there, his strength still existed, and few would dare to cross them. As you wish, Kidder finally replied. Great, Rigger said, resting his arms on the table. For now, focus on strengthening our base. Derek, finish the constructions. Kidder, investigate these potential partners. And Gorham, continue gathering intel on House Joylor and other noble houses and factions in Mealy's. I want results by the end of the week. Understood, they responded in unison. Rigger watched as the commanders stood and left the room one by one. Once alone, he let out a low sigh and stood up, walking over to the window. The city of Tinaver stretched out before him, bathed in the light of the setting sun. One step at a time. But before anything else, he needed a sword worthy of his ambitions. After the meeting with the commanders, Rigger left the Iron Legion's base and made his way to the bustling center of Tinaver. His boots struck the stone ground firmly, and the noise of the busy streets barely fazed him. This time, he had a clear goal: to register as an adventurer. That was the first thing I thought of when I realized I was in a magical world. It was a distant memory, back when he was just a child surrounded by forest, dreaming of all the things he could achieve. Becoming an adventurer had seemed like such a simple and straightforward dream back then. The idea of exploring ancient ruins, hunting legendary monsters, and amassing fame and fortune made his heart race with excitement. But in the tribe, there were no guilds, no nearby cities. It was just the Doldia tribe and the forest. The world felt too small back then. Now, however, the circumstances were different. Becoming an adventurer was no longer a distant dream, it was a necessity. Some members had registered as adventurers some time ago, but their progress had been frustratingly slow. Of course, it's not as advantageous as I once thought. Rigger reflected as he walked. There were many types of adventurers: solos, those who acted alone. Few could survive this way, but they existed. Groups, which were the norm. To form a group, there were no restrictions except that members' ranks could not be more than one level above or below the group leaders. Clans, created when at least two groups joined forces. Recently, some members of the Legion had formed their own adventuring groups and naturally united to create a clan. It was a positive step, but it brought a new problem: the lack of available jobs. Most of the missions in Tinaver were too simple for large groups or offered little reward, and Rigger knew that, over time, members of the Legion would scatter across the world. This problem will eventually resolve itself, but for now, we need a solution. One way to fix this was for him to become an S-class adventurer. If I can achieve a higher rank, I'll gain certain privileges. The clan will be able to take on more challenging missions, reducing the scarcity of jobs. But will the administrators allow it? It was an ambitious thought, but Rigger always preferred fast, direct results. If rank became an obstacle, he'd negotiate with those in charge, or use more persuasive methods if necessary. The Adventurers Guild was a large two-story building with a facade reinforced by dark wooden beams and a golden emblem above the door. Inside, it was filled with adventurers of all kinds, from poorly equipped rookies to veterans boasting gleaming armor and impressive weapons. As soon as Rigger entered, the hum of conversation seemed to dip for a moment. He could feel the eyes on him. It wasn't surprising. His presence, silver hair, fierce eyes, and an intimidating aura, rarely went unnoticed. Ignoring the whispers, he walked straight toward the main counter. Before he could say a word, a man leaning against the wall in light armor called out to him, "Hey, beast boy," the voice carried a mocking tone. "You part of that iron group, or something? I'd suggest you bring some backup." Rigger paused, turning his head in the man's direction. He was a tall human with an irritating smirk and a superior gaze, like someone used to provoking newcomers. For a moment, Rigger considered ignoring him. But the weight of the past few weeks had worn his patience thinner than he cared to admit. This is getting increasingly irritating. He took a deep breath. Lately, he found himself less willing to deal with these kinds of situations. Strong or not, he still looked like he was in his early teens, an easy target for intimidation. Many times, he thought about simply killing anyone who acted this way but always chose not to. Maybe I should start training Skoll to intimidate these people. One growl from him would make any idiot think twice before opening their mouth. Rigger stared coldly at the man, releasing a faint killing intent without another word. The subtle pressure made the adventurer hesitate for a moment, as if he realized he'd stepped onto dangerous ground. Rigger turned back and continued to the counter, where a half-elf receptionist waited for him, her expression neutral. "I want to speak with the person in charge of this branch," he said bluntly. The receptionist blinked, surprised by his direct approach, but maintained her composure. "The guild master is currently busy. Do you have a specific matter to discuss?" "Registration and rank classification," Rigger replied. "Tell him I'm the leader of the Iron Legion." The receptionist hesitated for a moment, but something in Rigger's gaze convinced her to comply. "Very well. Please wait a moment." While waiting, Rigger crossed his arms and surveyed the hall. Adventurers came and went, discussing missions or showing off their rewards. It was a dynamic world, one where everyone chased their own glory. For a moment he thought of his younger self, the one who dreamed of standing where he was now, becoming an SSS-class adventurer, a rank that didn't even exist in this world. If I told my younger self this, he'd never believe it. But he wasn't here chasing glory. Rigger had a greater purpose, and he was willing to use every resource at his disposal to achieve it. After some time waiting, the guild receptionist returned and said, "He is waiting in his office. Allow me to escort you there." Rigger followed her deeper into the guild's building. "He is in this room. You may enter." She bowed and left. The office of the Adventurer Guild branch leader was spacious yet simply decorated. Books and scrolls lined the shelves, while a detailed map of the region covered the main wall. Behind a sturdy desk, the leader, a tall bearded man, gazed at Rigger with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. He gestured toward the chair in front of the desk and said, "Who would have thought that the leader of the Iron Legion would be just a boy barely entering adolescence?" Rigger sat calmly, showing no emotion. He was used to being underestimated, though the comment still mildly annoyed him. After all, he was nearly 140 centimeters tall, which made him look older than his 9 years. However, he didn't bother correcting the man. "I'll get straight to the point," Rigger said, his voice calm but firm. "I want the Adventurer Guild to grant me an S-rank classification, along with 5 S-rank classifications for the core members of the Iron Legion. I also expect certain benefits when it comes to mission selection." The leader raised an eyebrow, surprised by the bold request. Crossing his arms, he replied, "Unfortunately, it's not that simple. There are rules to follow. It wouldn't be fair to other adventurers if we just handed you all S-rank classifications. High rankings require a proven record of successful missions. These missions are also a way for us to evaluate adventurers. We have a code of conduct here and can't allow just anyone to reach rank. Rigger remained impassive. I don't think it's wise for you to refuse this proposal, he said, leaning slightly forward. You've probably done your research on me as soon as I entered the city, but let me be clear. I'm only 9 years old and already a king-tier earth and wind mage, as well as a sword saint. The Iron Legion is constantly training and systematically growing stronger, physically, economically, and politically. Soon, it will be a force recognized worldwide. I can guarantee that. What I can't guarantee is that you'll have the advantage of supporting US while we're still in our early stages. The leader narrowed his eyes but didn't interrupt. Rigger continued, moreover, granting these classifications would benefit the guild. With the reputation the Legion will have in the future, there will be a significant influx of high-level adventurers through the Legion, boosting public trust in the guild and attracting more mission requests. The man rested his elbows on the desk, stroking his beard thoughtfully. Before he could speak, Rigger concluded, releasing a faint magical pressure into the room. And of course, I'd strongly recommend you accept. I'm still somewhat displeased with the reception I received upon arriving here. The pressure in the air wasn't suffocating, but it was enough to make the leader uncomfortable. He took a deep breath before hesitantly responding, I can grant you the S rank, but only for you. As for the other 5, I can offer A rank classifications on one condition. They'll need to complete specific missions to justify their promotions. Otherwise, it would be impossible to make it official, as even I cannot bypass the rules. Rigger tilted his head slightly, as if considering the proposal. In truth, he already knew his request was bold, but that's how negotiations worked, and he had the advantage of his strength. Pushing the limits was part of the strategy. Securing 5 A-rank positions for his members was a win, as his primary goal had always been obtaining his S rank. Very well. I'll send the members in question to speak with you later. What mission would I need to complete? The leader sighed in relief, visibly relaxing as Rigger agreed. He pulled a scroll from the cabinet behind him. This is a material hunting mission, but it's been gathering dust here for quite some time. A noble requested blue dragon scales to forge a flashy armor. The scales can only be obtained in the Blue Dragon range, an extremely dangerous region, which is why it remains incomplete. The reward is quite good though. I recommend taking a group. Rigger quickly read through the scroll, analyzing the details. Internally, he felt satisfied. He was already planning a trip to the Dwarven territories, and with this mission, he could combine his goals. Perfect. I'll accept this mission. The conversation became more relaxed after the two established an initial cooperation. They discussed future collaborations, such as sending members of the Legion to guild branches in other parts of the continent with fewer adventurers, strengthening the guild's presence while Rigger expanded the influence of his organization. Both recognized the potential for a mutually beneficial partnership. When Rigger finally left the guild, he looked at the new adventurer card he had received. His name gleamed with the S rank beside it. He couldn't help but feel a slight sense of pride. This was just another step toward consolidating his position in the world. Name, Rigger Adoldia. Gender, male race, beast race. Age, 9 years. Job, magic swordsman. Rank, S group, Iron Legion. With a faint smile on his face, he tucked the card away and walked back to the barracks, already thinking about how to inform the selected members of the Legion about their future rankings and the new mission awaiting them. The sound of heavy footsteps and labored breathing echoed through the clearing. Skull, the massive ebony-colored wolf, charged with ferocity, his coat shimmering in the sunlight. Though he was already the size of a horse, he was still just a pup. Ebony wolves seemed to grow very large. His eyes shone with determination as he tried to bite Rigger, who moved with superhuman agility. Around them, Taze, Kidder, Idar, Joseph, and 5 other members of the Iron Legion encircled Rigger, coordinating their attacks. It was an uneven battle, 10 against 1, with Rigger limiting himself to auxiliary magic, relying on his sword, monstrous strength, and extraordinary senses and combat instincts. Yet the difficulty of the match was evident. Kidder was the first to strike, his enormous sword roaring as it cut through the air. He aimed a direct blow at Rigger's side, who parried with his blade. The earth around them immediately shifted into spikes, but Rigger sidestepped using Flash Step, vanishing momentarily and reappearing several meters to the left. Before he could catch his breath, Skull was already on his heels, his claws tearing through the ground. With a swift spell, Rigger used earth manipulation to raise a rock barrier between himself and the wolf, but Skull shattered it with brute strength, leaping at him. Rigger spun his azure sword with precision, deflecting the attack and creating a gust of wind that forced Skull to retreat. "Nice try, kid." Rigger smiled, even as he analyzed the movements of the group around him. Idar then took the lead, engaging in close combat, his water god style evident in his fluid movements and counterattacks. He advanced with a series of rapid strikes, exploiting the gaps created by Taze and Joseph. Taze, with his fire-imbued sword, used earth and wind spells to create distractions, while Joseph alternated between the ferocity of the sword god style and the versatility of the north god style, switching between quick attacks and weapon throws. Rigger blocked Idar's strikes with impressive ease, but had to manipulate the surrounding earth again to deflect Taze's magical barrages. Joseph seized the opportunity to attempt a strike from behind, but Rigger was already prepared. He vanished again with flash step, reappearing behind Joseph and knocking him down with a punch to the ribs, sending him flying. The combat unfolded at breakneck speed, with the clearing constantly reshaped and destroyed by the impacts. Joseph retreated, groaning. Skull took advantage of the distraction to lunge at Rigger from the side, his enormous jaws aiming for the azure sword. Rigger moved swiftly, dodging and channeling Tuki to enhance his strength. He then delivered a flying kick to the giant wolf, sending it sprawling. Kidder shouted as he swung his massive sword in a powerful attack. At the same time, Idar re-engaged Rigger in close combat, while Taze, from the opposite flank, unleashed supercharged fire and wind spells at Rigger. The coordinated combination forced Rigger to fight on multiple fronts. Rigger retreated a few meters, blocking Kidder's blade with his own and using flow to cut through Taze's combined magic with a vertical slash, splitting the fiery wave. In a fluid motion, he dodged Idar's strike and created a shockwave by spinning his sword, knocking down two of the weaker members of the group. The battle continued at a stalemate for a while. Shockwaves, explosions, clashing blades, and the destruction of trees filled the forest. Whenever Rigger was about to take someone out, Taze would save them with some creative use of magic or face him heated with his sword. "You're improving," Rigger noted, deciding to end it for today. With an explosive leap, Rigger soared above the field, landing directly in front of Taze. Before he could react, Rigger struck the ground with force, using earth magic to create tremors and cracks that unbalanced the entire group. Skull tried to intercept him, but Rigger leapt again, slamming his sword into the ground to create another shockwave. What followed was a swift and relentless hunt of the disoriented group. When the dust finally settled, only Rigger was left standing. Rigger spun the blue sword, brushing off the dust from its blade, before turning to Taze, who was still kneeling, catching his breath and healing himself. "An adventurer told me something about the North God style at the Saint level and beyond the other day," Rigger began. "It requires the use of any tricks or methods necessary to win. And you utilized that very well today." Taze lifted his head, still panting heavily. "Even though you're still lacking in terms of physical strength and Tuki," Rigger paused, observing the young man. "However, overall, your battle strength has already reached the level of a saint." Taze's eyes widened in surprise. "I can't officially name you as such, but you can already consider yourself a saint of the North, Taze." For a moment, the young man remained silent, trying to process what he'd just heard. Then, a wide smile spread across his face. "Thank you, Chief. I won't let you down." Taze had always worked hard to reach this point. As a child, he trained tirelessly to defeat and surpass Rigger. But during the attacks of slave merchants on the tribe, his perspective began to shift. He realized it might not be such a bad idea to follow Rigger, and time had proven his decision right. He had often worried his strength was falling behind. His leader improved so quickly that Taze feared his own abilities would become obsolete. This drove him to never relax in his training, copying Rigger's methods and developing various magical combat techniques. Today's event was a major step in the right direction. He was confident he was no longer a burden and felt genuinely happy. Rigger nodded slightly, maintaining his calm demeanor. Taze returned the gesture, still wearing his radiant smile. "But don't get complacent. You only reached this level through magical tactics. Without those, you're still at the advanced level." "Understood," Taze replied, his enthusiasm unwavering. Rigger then said his goodbyes to the rest of the group and left the clearing. As he reached the edge of the training grounds, he spotted Pycak waiting for him, looking eager to talk. Rigger walked along the trail leading back to the headquarters of the Iron Legion, listening to Pycak beside him. The logistical commander was deep in thought, discussing the steady growth of the Legion and some important decisions that needed to be made. Pycak asked about all sorts of matters: new recruits applying to join, trade agreements, training methods, and plans for future outposts. Rigger knew that if he were to manage the Iron Legion alone, the work would never end. That's why he instructed Pycak to only bring him the most critical issues. Meles has also shown no signs of interference or hostility so far. Pycak glanced at Rigger with an approving expression. It seems your strength is a greater deterrent than we anticipated. This gives us room to operate with more peace of mind. Rigger nodded. For now, things seem to be under control. He could proceed with his plans to travel to the Dwarven territories without significant concerns. It had been over a month since the Iron Legion established itself in the region, and the base was more solid than he had expected. Even so, something continued to trouble him. The Joylore house is also quiet. Too quiet. They must have learned by now that I'm Verdia's student. I was expecting a stronger reaction, he said, frowning as his unease became evident. Pycak snorted. Maybe they've backed off after the last saint you killed in the Great Forest. Or they're planning something big. Rigger didn't respond immediately, his thoughts drifting over the possibilities. Another matter, however, had been occupying his attention more frequently. The mating season had started again, and it was creating complications. He let out a soft sigh as he recalled the behavior of the Legion over the past few weeks. Taze was already involved with Lisa, one of the slaves who had joined the Iron Legion after being rescued, and he seemed to handle the situation well. But for Rigger, things were different. Almost all the single beast women in the Legion were trying to seduce him in every way imaginable. Even some who were still children were attempting to impress him with glances or small gestures. No matter how much he tried to stay calm, Rigger couldn't ignore the growing strength of his instincts. He was only 9 years old, but the blood of his race already coursed through his veins with intensity, and controlling himself was becoming increasingly difficult. He still had enough self-discipline, but he knew this control wouldn't last forever. More importantly, he wasn't entirely opposed to the idea. Some of the women in the Legion genuinely attracted him, and denying that would be a lie. Still, two things kept him cautious. First, he was too young. The little Rigger still hadn't grown much, so he preferred to wait a bit longer. Second, there was the risk of losing control to his instincts during sex. Having a child impulsively wasn't part of his plans for the next few years. I'll just hold myself back for now, he thought. When he finally arrived at the Legion's headquarters, his gaze was immediately drawn to several beast women watching him. Some smiled openly, while others cast furtive glances. Rigger took a deep breath, crossing the gate with firm steps, as a faint, mischievous smile formed on his face. His journey was just beginning, and every step brought him closer to his destiny, and to challenges that only continued to grow. Rigger walked through the Iron Legion base, observing the activities and progress of each sector. Wherever he passed, the members greeted him with respect, some with evident enthusiasm. He waved back, offering a discreet smile as he continued. It was fascinating to see how everything was developing. As he crossed one of the training zones, his gaze settled on a group of children led by Rufus. Yen, the former slave trader, had reinforced the training of the younger children in the Legion and seemed to be adapting well to this new life. In fact, his son was among the young trainees, showing dedication and determination. Rufus, in turn, seemed to have befriended a peculiar boy from the Beastmen race named Garrison. He was part deer, with small horns beginning to sprout from his head. Despite his delicate appearance, Garrison demonstrated remarkable combat talent, particularly with spears, which was his favorite weapon. However, Rigger couldn't help but notice some prejudice associated with the use of spears among warriors. He knew this was deeply tied to stories about the Superd, a demon race described as terribly evil. His master, Verdia, once told him she had met a Superd. According to her, he was incredibly strong, but Rigger had never seen reason to judge someone just based on the weapon they wielded. Still, he had yet to meet a Superd to form an opinion on them. In fact, he made it a point to cultivate diversity in weapons within the Legion. To him, the predominance of swords as a symbol of combat was too restrictive. There were countless possibilities beyond that, and he wanted his warriors to explore each of them. Rufus Wolf, Jerry, was also growing quickly and helped with the children's and Rufus training. The animal seemed to be almost a celebrity among the children, admired as much as Rufus himself. Rufus' skill with magic and having such a large wolf made him a kind of unquestionable leader among the youths. After watching for a long time, Rigger couldn't help but smile as he noticed Rufus trying to imitate his way of giving orders. It was an endearing sight, and he felt proud of the boy's progress. He had already taught Rufus most of the beginner-level magic and even some advanced spells. His latest advice had been for the young man to focus on improving his magic control and practical skills without chanting, something crucial for future magic. As he observed the training, a beast girl from the Adoldia tribe approached him. She appeared to be around 13 or 14 years old, with reddish-brown hair and strikingly beautiful features. Pushed by her friends, she took a few hesitant steps, her ears twitching nervously. "Hey, leader," she began, her voice trembling. "Would you like to go for a walk around the city with me?" Rigger turned to her, surprised for a brief moment before giving her a kind smile. The girl's tail wagged frantically as she waited for a response, revealing her excitement and nervousness. "Unfortunately, I don't have time at the moment," Rigger replied politely and sincerely. "But I appreciate the invitation. Maybe another time." Her poorly expressed words left her, and the girl's expression changed noticeably. Her ears drooped, and her tail stopped moving. "Of course," she murmured, disappointed, before slowly moving away. Rigger sighed softly, feeling a little concerned, but he knew he had priorities to attend to. He thought about all the divisions that the Legion's outer branch currently had. First Division, Combat and Tactical Operations Commander, Taze Dodoldia, Beastman Feline, Vice Commander, Dravos Bloodscale, Demon Race. Second Division, Training and Education Commander, Anira Viner Human, Vice Commander Yen Human. Third Division, Logistics and Support Commander, Haikak Human, Vice Commander Liana Human. Fourth Division, Communication and Intelligence Commander, Goran Redwine, Dwarf, Vice Commander, Tovan Adoldia, Beastman K9. Fifth Division, Internal, Control and Security Commander, Joseph Longrob Human Vice Commander, Myron Frostvale, Elf. Sixth Division, Research and Development Commander, Jory Janavrio, Dwarf, Vice Commander Calda Human. Seventh Division, Exploration and Reconnaissance Commander, Idar Human, Vice Commander, Elusa Ragebear, Elf. Eighth Division, Medicine and Alchemy Commander, Lyra Human, Vice Commander, Elian Human. Ninth Division, Commerce and Diplomacy Commander, Launark Elf, Vice Commander Selena Warith, Beastman Rabbit. 10th Division, Administration and Human Resources Commander, Derek Human, Vice Commander Lewis Beastman. Estimated number of members, 844. It was quite a lot, and their numbers were growing rapidly, as one of the main activities of the Combat and Tactical Operations Division was attacking and recovering slaves from various places. In the Commerce and Diplomacy Division, Rigger found Darvin negotiating with a local merchant. 15 gold pieces for the lot is a robbery, the merchant exclaimed. Darvin calm countered, with our protection on the roads, the profit will triple. Rigger sat down, listening to the conversation. He's right, Rigger said. But remember, we want allies, not just business. Offer a small discount as a gesture of goodwill. The merchant thanked Rigger. Thank you, sir. You won't regret it. Rigger walked calmly through the base, his eyes scanning each sector attentively. He arrived at the Research and Development Division, where he was greeted by Calda, the vice commander of the division. Master Rigger, Calda said, bowing respectfully. We were expecting you. How's the research on the Black Gem going? Rigger asked, getting straight to the point. Calda sighed slightly before responding. We've confirmed that it is the same type found among the demon races. The type that grants specific abilities, but we're facing difficulties extracting the black energy you mentioned. Before parting ways, Rigger looked at Calda and asked, and the other research? Any progress? Calda adjusted his glasses and answered, we're testing the compatibility of minerals with mana for the mass-built magical weapons project and investigating simpler, easier enchantment symbols. There's still a lot of work, but the initial results are promising. Rigger nodded, satisfied. Great. Make sure to keep this well documented. Rigger pondered for a moment before giving his orders. Designate someone to continue the research on the Black Gem. The rest of the team can disperse to other projects. I don't want all focus to be on this. Understood, sir, Calder replied, agreeing. With that settled, Rigger left the sector, walking through other areas of the base. He observed the divisions of the Iron Legion functioning at full capacity and felt a pang of pride at the progress. The base was growing day by day, and the members were becoming increasingly well organized. Rigger paused for a moment, observing Skoll, Jerry, and Frecky playing in a corner of the training field. Despite their already intimidating sizes and the strength they displayed, they still had a youthful energy that made the Legion's children adore them. Taming them had been easier than he expected, perhaps because they resembled dogs so much, or because many of them were of Beastman descent. He still had time to figure that out. He didn't dwell on the future. In a few months, it would be his 10th birthday. The members of the Legion had planned to throw a big celebration, but he wouldn't be present to take part. His next journey would take him to the Dwarven territory, and he would be leaving soon. Rigger didn't pay much attention to birthdays. In his current life, he had only celebrated once with his mother when he was 5, and he didn't miss it. However, before leaving, he wrote a few letters. Messages were sent to the Great Forest, addressed to his master, Verdia, his parents, Hontar and Celine, Killian, and Gustav. He wrote about his progress, expressed how much he missed them, and mentioned he was preparing to travel to the Dwarven territory. He had decided that his wolf, Skoll, would travel with him. These animals had grown faster than expected and had shown remarkable loyalty to their owners. Skoll would be his trump card, his final ace in case something went wrong during the journey. Although he was out of action, he didn't think he could do much, but hey, why not? As his thoughts wandered, he decided to give some basic instructions to those who would focus on things in his absence. He would hold a meeting. Rigger considered himself a good leader, as he carried ideas from his previous world to implement innovative and efficient strategies. More importantly, he was strong enough that no one questioned his orders, only offered suggestions. Rigger found this quite useful. Even with his previous life, there were people who had lived 10 times longer than he had, and their experience was valuable. Sometimes he wondered if he was worthy of such a position, but he quickly discarded the thought. The first step toward doubting himself would be doubting his own abilities. He would do his best and correct his mistakes with their help. In the days leading up to his departure, Rigger gathered the commanders of all the divisions in a large meeting room at the center of the base. They sat around a circular table while Rigger stood, observing each one with a firm and determined look. "As you may have already been informed, I will be away for some time," he began. "I want everything to continue running perfectly in my absence. Each division has an essential responsibility for the growth of the Iron Legion. Trust each other, support one another, and stay focused. In my absence, follow the leadership of Kidder Didoldia." The commanders nodded, but one of them, Joseph, in charge of internal control and security, crossed his arms. "With all due respect, sir, it's difficult to maintain order without your presence. The members rely more on you and your strength than on us." Rigger didn't hesitate. "This is why we are building this structure. The Legion cannot depend only on me. If something happens to me, you must be able to lead. Believe in your abilities. I believe in you." The weight of Rigger's words eased the tension, and Joseph, though reluctant, nodded. During the meeting, Rigger delegated specific tasks to each division and made it clear that he trusted each commander to maintain a stable base. Later, Rigger found Idar in the main courtyard. "Are you really going alone?" he said. "That doesn't seem wise. The blue dragons are rank S monsters, and they almost always travel in groups." Rigger replied, "I won't be alone. Skoll will be with me, and I trust my own strength to escape from a group of flying lizards if necessary." "Maybe you're one of the few people who calls dragons flying lizards." Rigger laughed. "It's necessary. The other day I tried using a staff from one of the Legion members to cast magic, and it made a normal fire spell 3 times stronger. It's an excellent staff, and it made me realize how much of a leap it would be if I could have a magical stone embedded in my sword. It's essential for my future plans." Idar sighed but respected Rigger's decision. The next day, Rigger gathered Rufus, Garrison, and the other children of the Legion for one last training session before leaving. He watched Rufus giving orders to the others, and the resemblance between the young boy and himself made him smile. "Rufus," Rigger called. "Come here." Rufus moved over with Jerry at his side. "Yes, Chief. While I'm away, you are the leader of the children's division. I want you to take care of them and continue their training. Teach them what you've learned and keep the order. Can I count on you?" Rufus puffed out his chest with pride. "You can count on me." Rigger stroked the wolf Jerry's head before standing up. "I trust you. Don't disappoint me." Finally, Rigger visited the base's forge. The heat of the flames was intense, and the sound of the hammer striking metal filled the space. He spoke briefly with the blacksmiths, ordering repairs for his weapons and checking the supplies. Before leaving, he thanked them for their hard work. On his last night before departure, while watching the base lit by moonlight, a messenger approached. "Sir, we've received information about House Joylore. Still no movement, like most of the noble houses in Mealy's. At this moment, there are no issues with your departure." Rigger stared at the horizon, where the territory of the expected years awaited him. "Understood. Keep monitoring and inform me of any updates." The Iron Legion was strong and united, but he knew that the next step of his journey would bring even greater challenges. The dawn rose over Tinaver as Rigger made the final preparations for his departure. In front of the Iron Legion base, a small group waited to say their goodbyes. Taze, Rufus, Kidder, and the wolves, Jerry, Frecky, and Skull were lined up. Taze, with a firm gaze, was the first to speak. "Take care, Chief. I know you're strong, but it's like you always tell me. Never let your guard down." Rigger nodded with a confident smile. "Don't worry, Taze. You all take care of the Legion while I'm away." Rufus, looking anxious, handed over a small wooden talisman. He was anxious because he hadn't been apart from Rigger for a long time after being rescued. "It's a protection talisman," Mr. Pycax said. "The dwarves use one when they go on long journeys." Rigger took the talisman and tied it beside the sheath of his sword. "Thanks, Rufus. I'll use it as a reminder to come back in one piece." He ruffled the little dwarf's hair. Kidder, who would now take command of the Legion, stepped forward. "Don't worry about anything here. I'll keep the Iron Legion in order. When you return, we'll be even stronger." Rigger placed a hand on Kidder's shoulder, showing his trust. "I trust you. I know you'll do a great job." The wolves approached, led by Skull. The large wolf, with ebony fur, looked at Rigger excitedly, as if he understood the importance of the moment. Rigger petted his companion's head, climbed onto his back, and adjusted his posture. The silence was broken by a howl from Skull, echoing through the forest, followed by others from Jerry and Frecky. Rigger gave the group one last look. "See you later." And then, with a swift movement, Skull dashed down the forest trail, leaving a trail of dust behind. The run was intense. Skull's speed made the trees blur around Rigger. He was used to moving fast, but riding Skull was a unique experience. Despite this, he estimated the journey would still take about 15 to 20 days, even at that speed. "If I ran alone at full speed, I'd probably get there in less than half the time," Rigger muttered to himself. "But I think I can use this time to hunt some monsters, train some techniques, and test new tactics." Rigger felt that he was about to enter a period of great physical growth in the near future. His senses were becoming sharper with each passing year. He could hear the faintest snap of twigs on the ground or the distant sound of a river flowing. His eyes, adapted to the wild environment, could distinguish shapes and movements even in the twilight of the forest. His physical strength was already impressive, capable of rivaling weaker Saint-level warriors even without Tuki. However, his mana capacity was slowing his growth. He felt that his progress was becoming slower with each passing day. Rigger knew from his experiments that a person's mana capacity increased exponentially during childhood, but slowed as they approached the age of 10. After that, growth would be insignificant, often taking decades to notice any significant change before eventually halting completely. "Maybe it's something that varies from person to person, but I don't have to worry about that for now. I think I'm already one of the people with the most mana in the world right now, and I know more than 100 spells of different elements and uses," he reflected. "That, combined with my physical strength and Tuki, already places me at a level that few can reach in their lifetime, and I'm still only almost 10 years old." Still, Rigger was not satisfied. He desired more. In his thoughts, the idea of becoming the strongest in the world surfaced. But he knew that such a title was not easily attained. He didn't even know who the three first of the 7 great powers were. The demon god Laplace, the 4th ranked, was the strongest known, and his mentor Verdia had described his strength as divine. Rigger thought that, eventually, he could surpass him after learning a bit about what he was capable of. But the others... The dragon god, the god of technique, and even the missing fighting god were enigmas. It's no use thinking too much about it now. I have plenty of time ahead, Rigger said, giving a light pat on Skoll's neck. A long lifespan means many opportunities to improve. He also pondered his future plans. The Iron Legion was just starting, but he already envisioned its influence expanding throughout the central continent, reaching Meles and maybe even the Demon Continent. His goals were grand, but he knew he needed to be cautious and patient. After hours of running, the sound of the forest changed. Skoll slowed down, his ears standing up, signaling danger nearby. Rigger dismounted carefully, adjusting his sword while scanning the surroundings. "Monsters," he murmured. From the trees, a group of grotesque creatures emerged. They were mutated wolves, with black fur and red eyes, larger than any ordinary wolf. Rigger counted at least 5 of them, moving in formation. Well, looks like the training has already begun. He signaled for Skoll to take a defensive position. "I'll handle this alone." With a swift movement, Rigger advanced. He used reinforcement Tuki on his legs, increasing his speed. The first strike was direct, snapping the neck of one of the wolves. He spun in midair, dodging the attack of another while kicking the attacker in the jaw. Rigger's senses were at their peak. With each step, each movement, he anticipated as if he could predict the next few seconds. When the last wolf attacked, he grabbed the creature by the neck with his bare hands and slammed it into a tree with brutal force. "That was a good warm-up," he said, wiping his sword with a quick swipe. Skoll approached, barking softly, as if approving of the performance. That night, while they rested around a campfire, Rigger looked up at the starry sky. Skoll was lying beside him, his eyes alert to the surroundings. "There's still so much to do, Skoll." The large wolf responded with a small grunt, resting his head on his front paws. Rigger smiled, watching the flames dance. "Let's see what tomorrow brings." And so the journey continued, with new challenges and discoveries ahead. As Rigger and Skoll continued their journey through the vast and wild land, Rigger's thoughts wandered far beyond the dangers of the road. His immediate goal was clear: reach the Dwarven territory. But in moments of silence, his mind occupied itself with matters he had long avoided. "I need to start looking for a wife when I return. It would be good to find someone soon," Rigger reflected with a slight sigh. Among his many thoughts about the future of the Iron Legion and his own plans to become the strongest in the world, he had always wanted someone by his side. The first person who came to mind was his master, Verdia. "At least the first step has already been taken. I need to win her over gradually when I meet her again." Rigger murmured to himself, with a small smile, though there were obvious complications. It was widely known that elves, even the most affectionate ones, had a low libido, which initially left Rigger conflicted about it. He didn't see himself as an insatiable sexual beast, but he knew he wanted a more active relationship with his future wife. This dilemma, however, was gradually resolved as he adapted to the social peculiarities of this world and to his master's teachings, who had said that she herself had once had a passion for someone who already had 3 wives. Polygamy was common in this world, especially among nobles, tribes, and cultures like his own, and he realized this could be a solution to his dilemma. He still remembered the moment when Gustav, the tribe leader, suggested with absolute seriousness, "You should take the 2 heirs and your master as wives." At the time, the suggestion shocked him. But the more time passed, the more he grew accustomed to the idea of polygamy, as long as he had the approval of his other eventual wife. "Of course, it would have to be someone I really like, and who likes me too," Rigger pondered. He began to catalogue his preferences. "I like more mature women. That hasn't changed since my past life," he thought. He still remembered the women he admired back on Earth, but here in this world, something had changed. He had developed an admiration for powerful women. Not just physically, but those who possessed undeniable strength of character, skill, and presence. Back on Earth, strength or power didn't mean much. Maybe if the girl went to the gym and did some workouts, she'd gain some points, he thought with humor. But here, it's different. Strength is a symbol of effort and influence, of domination. And I really want someone who shares that. He mentally evaluated the women in the Legion. Some were attractive and competent, but he knew they would fall far behind in terms of strength, power, and skill. This thought made him wonder if his preference for strength and power had been influenced by living among beast folk. Maybe I've been more influenced by the tribe's culture and my bestial DNA than I realized, he thought, laughing to himself. But even amidst these reflections, the name of his master always returned to the center of his thoughts. Verdia. He whispered, remembering her fondly. Her image was clear in his mind, her golden hair waving in the wind, her eyes full of wisdom and kindness, the confident posture of a mage with countless accomplishments and stories, and a teacher. It was an irresistible combination. Verdia was not only beautiful, but also strong, experienced, and caring. He thought about the things his master still desired, flying through the skies and diving into the depths of the seas. Among her goals was the development of flight magic. He had clear ideas for creating it, as he could already fly with wind magic, but it was still rudimentary, based on multiple small wind bursts. He had an idea, but needed to gather practical information to make it work. His main reference would be the Chaos Breaker, the floating fortress of Perugius, the armored Dragon King. He believed that by understanding the principle of magical buoyancy applied there, he would be able to replicate something similar, even on a smaller scale. "I'll need to reach the central continent to see this up close," he murmured. In addition, there was water magic. He had a skill in mind that he had seen in Avatar in his past life, something related to precise control of water and air to create protective spheres that maintained oxygen inside. This would be relatively simple with the amount of mana he currently possessed. He just needed magical control. Even so, there was something that worried him: the creatures of the ocean depths. Even in his previous life, where there was no mana, marine animals were terrifying. He didn't want to imagine how dangerous they could be in this world, where even the most common beasts were already lethal. "I'll need to be cautious when I get to that stage," he thought. For now, Rigger decided to leave those thoughts for the future. He was confident that time would bring him the answers. And if he couldn't find anyone to interest him, his master would suffice. With a determined smile, he looked at Skoll, who was tirelessly running through the forest. "Yes, Skoll, the goals keep piling up. But one step at a time." And so, Rigger continued his journey, his thoughts divided between the challenges ahead and the possibilities of a future yet to be built. The metallic sound of swords being unsheathed echoed through the forest. Rigger had already noticed the ambush even before the bandits revealed themselves. 5 men emerged from behind the trees, their faces marked with greedy smiles and cruel gazes. All were armed, surrounding him. "Hey kid, why don't you leave your stuff and save us the trouble?" one of them said, wielding a heavy axe and looking at Rigger with disdain. Rigger responded with an incredulous look. Did this guy not notice that he was mounted on a massive wolf? This was getting ridiculous. Was his intelligence being reduced by the plot? He advanced without a word. One of them attempted an initial strike, swinging his sword toward Rigger. Rigger dodged with an agile movement, leaning to the side, and in the blink of an eye, drove his fingers into the man's throat. A choked sound echoed as the bandit fell, clutching his neck. Next. Rigger's voice was focused. The others hesitated for a moment, but rage quickly spurred them on. 2 of them charged together, attempting to coordinate an attack on both flanks. Rigger spun his body, dodging a vertical strike, and in a fluid motion, delivered a kick to the knee joint of one attacker. A sickening crack echoed as the man collapsed to his knees, screaming in pain. Before he could react, Rigger delivered a straight punch to the man's temple, knocking him out instantly. The second bandit tried to seize the moment, but Rigger was faster. He ducked, passing under the opponent's strike, and with a savage movement, drove his fingers like a blade into the man's heart. The bandit fell backward, dead before he hit the ground. The 2 remaining bandits were terrified. One of them took a step back, but the leader shouted, "Don't retreat." Hesitation proved fatal. Rigger dashed toward the leader, his movements like those of a wild beast, agile and unpredictable. He landed a direct punch to the man's chest, shattering his sternum. The bandit dropped his axe and fell to his knees, coughing blood. The last bandit dropped his sword and tried to run, but Skoll appeared out of nowhere, grabbing him from behind with a ferocious bite. The man fell, screaming desperately as the wolf held his limp body between its teeth. Rigger stood in the clearing, looking at the bodies strewn around. His breathing was controlled, his gaze disinterested. Weak. He approached Skoll, who still held one of the bandits by his tattered clothes. "Drop it." The wolf released the corpse, licking his lips, his tail wagging. Then Rigger heard a sound coming from the road, shouting and the sound of a moving wagon. He turned toward it and saw a small caravan being attacked by another group of bandits. Without hesitation, Rigger climbed onto Skull. Let's go. With a few powerful leaps, Skull crossed the forest, quickly reaching the caravan. The bandits turned toward him, startled at the sight of Rigger mounted on a colossal wolf. They barely had time to react before Rigger leaped off Skull and dispatched them with the same ease as the previous group. The travelers, initially terrified, soon approached with looks of relief and gratitude. A man, apparently the group's leader, bowed. "Thank you, sir, for saving us. We can never repay you." Rigger waved a hand, cutting him off. "Just move along. Take care of yourselves." He climbed back onto Skull and left without looking back. It had been 7 days since he began traveling, and the recent fights had helped him refine his technique. Rigger was developing something unique. Deciding to start unarmed, his recent battles had helped him lay the groundwork for what he had long planned to create, a versatile and powerful style adaptable to any situation. Inspired by the aggression of the Sword God style and the versatility of the North God style, he incorporated constant movement, precise and brutal attacks on the enemy's weak points. He also adapted elements from his previous life, recalling an Israeli combat style focused on survival, Krav Maga, attacking quickly at lethal points like the throat, heart, and joints. Mixing these techniques with the wild style of the Doldia tribe and some grappling advances, he created something unique, a fighting style that embodied the ferocity of a beast. It was still just the beginning. He knew he had much to learn. The three great styles still held many secrets he needed to master, and there were other fighting styles scattered across the world that he had yet to discover. But he wasn't in a hurry. There was time for everything. His goal now wasn't to instantly create a combat style, but to have an initial idea in his mind of his preference in battle. As Rigger reflected on this, a name came to him. Beast God style. He murmured to himself. He smiled. That would be the name. One day, when he became worthy of carrying the title of God, the style would be complete. With Skull running through the vast forest and the road ahead of him, Rigger felt he was on the right path. The future was promising, and he was ready to conquer it. Rigger felt the cold wind on his face as he rode atop Skull. The scenery around him had changed drastically. Trees still spread out on one side of the landscape, but on the other, immense mountain ranges began to dominate the horizon. He knew he was nearing the Blue Dragon Mountain Range, a legendary formation that harbored tales of ancient glories and blue dragons. At the foot of those mountains lived the Coal Mine tribe, renowned for their exceptional skills in mining and forging. Rigger's destination was close, and he couldn't wait to reach the dwarves to finally strengthen his sword. Skull advanced with steady strides, his sharp eyes scanning the terrain. It was then that Rigger noticed something peculiar in the distance. A small camp of about 20 people stood out among the trees, near a trail leading to the mountains. Rustic tents made of hides reinforced with wood surrounded an extinguished campfire. Curious to find out who they were, Rigger decided to approach. However, before he could get close, a metallic glint caught his attention. It was fast, almost imperceptible, but instinct and training acted faster. An axe hurtled toward him at high speed, slicing through the air with a menacing sound. Rigger raised his hand in an automatic gesture and conjured a physical barrier in front of himself and Skull. The impact was loud, echoing through the area. The axe ricocheted off the barrier, flying to the side and embedding itself in a nearby tree. Skull halted his run with an agile leap, landing on a boulder as if preparing for the next move. Rigger, still mounted on the wolf, looked toward the camp with a firm gaze. His voice rang out clear and commanding. "Is this the Coal Mine tribe's welcome?" He wasn't certain, but the odds were high. The impact of his words was immediate. The dwarves, who had been grabbing weapons and shielding their women and children, froze, confused. Murmurs spread among them, and then from the trees, a dwarf emerged. He was short, as expected, but of sturdy build. His skin was marked by the harsh life of mining, and his reddish hair was tied back with leather strips, while a thick beard adorned with metallic beads hung down to his chest. A runic axe, heavy and lethal, rested on his back. "Adoldia!" the dwarf shouted, raising his hands in a gesture of apology. "Forgive me. I saw an ebony wolf charging toward the camp and attacked without thinking. Is it yours?" Rigger nodded, maintaining his composure atop Skull. "Yes, he is." The dwarf scratched his head, visibly uncomfortable. His eyes shifted between Rigger and Skull, clearly impressed by the wolf's imposing presence. "Well, you don't see Adoldia around here often. let alone one commanding a beast like that. Come in, lad. Let's make up for this misunderstanding. Despite the welcoming words, Rigger noticed the camp was still on edge. The dwarf's eyes remained alert and suspicious as he and Skull approached. Rigger dismounted when they reached the camp's center. The weight of wary stares still lingered, but the tension began to ease as the dwarf, who had introduced himself as Rainfall, walked ahead. "Youth from the Doldia tribe, I am Rainfall of the Coal Mine tribe," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Apologies for the incident. It's not every day we see an ebony wolf in these parts, especially one tamed." Rigger shook the dwarf's hand, feeling the strength in his grip. It was clear Rainfall wasn't just a miner or blacksmith, but a seasoned warrior. "Rigger a Doldia," he replied simply. "And this is Skull. I thought the dwarves lived deeper in the mountains. What brings you here?" The wolf sniffed the air, watching the dwarves cautiously. Some still hesitated, but others looked at Skull with curiosity and admiration. Rainfall gestured for Rigger to follow him. "We're just a caravan. Our mission is to deliver a shipment of weapons to a group that ordered them from our clan. We're not used to unexpected visitors, but since you're here, have a seat and rest." Rigger followed Rainfall to the center of the camp, where weapons were neatly organized in reinforced crates. Swords, axes, and spears, all of exceptional quality, gleamed under the sunlight filtering through the trees. As they talked, Rigger couldn't help but study Rainfall. The way he moved, the muscles in his arms, and the runic axe on his back all spoke of his experience in combat. An idea began to take shape in his mind. "You seem strong, Rainfall," Rigger said suddenly. "How about a sparring match?" The dwarf blinked, surprised, but then broke into a wide, enthusiastic grin. "A spar?" he laughed, stroking his beard. "You want to test your luck against a dwarven warrior, boy?" "I want to test your strength," Rigger replied seriously, crossing his arms. "I want to see what you're capable of." The dwarves around them, already attentive, began to buzz with excitement. Murmurs spread, and soon the small crowd gathered to watch the challenge. "Very well," Rainfall bellowed, pulling the axe from his back. "But let me warn you, I don't go easy, not even on guests or kids." They moved to a more open area, with other dwarves eagerly following to watch, forming a circle around them. The match began, and Rigger immediately realized Rainfall was a formidable opponent. The dwarf attacked with brute force, swinging his axes in powerful arcs and using earth magic to create obstacles and project attacks. Though he still required chanting, limiting his efficiency, the mere fact he could use magic was a testament to his skill. His abilities were those of a well-trained advanced warrior, perhaps even close to a saint-level fighter. Rigger retreated and observed, studying Rainfall's every move. Despite the dwarf's strength, Rigger felt confident Taze could probably defeat him. But that didn't mean this fight would be easy. Finally, after understanding the patterns in Rainfall's attacks, Rigger decided to end the match. He used the Longsword of Light, the ultimate technique of the Sword God style. The sword's brilliance illuminated the battlefield as he disarmed Rainfall and stopped the blade just a centimeter from the dwarf's throat. Silence fell. The dwarves, who had been cheering moments before, were now stunned, their faces frozen in disbelief. "He beat Rainfall." One of them murmured, incredulous. "Not just anyone defeats one of the strongest warriors of the Coal Mine tribe. And isn't he just a kid?" Rainfall raised his hands in surrender, smiling despite his exhaustion. "I'll admit, boy, you're far more than you seem. It was an honor to cross blades with you." Rigger lowered his sword and sheathed it, nodding. "Thank you. It was a good fight." The dwarves seemed less suspicious of him after the victory, and many approached to congratulate him. Some even tried to get close to Skull, but the wolf growled softly, making them retreat with nervous laughter. As night fell, the camp transformed into a festive place. Without any apparent reason, the dwarves decided to celebrate. Barrels of beer were opened, and abundant food was distributed. Rigger joined in the celebration, impressed by the hospitality of these people who, just hours before, barely trusted him. Skull seemed to be enjoying himself too. Some bolder dwarves played and pretended to fight him, laughing as the wolf growled playfully or pushed them away. Between sips of beer and hearty laughter, Rigger felt the dwarves were far better than he had imagined. He had formed a great first impression of the Coal Mine tribe and was beginning to better understand the dwarven society. They were gruff and distrustful, but also knew how to welcome someone who proved their worth. Dawn brought a frantic rhythm to the dwarven camp. They were preparing to move on, loading their weapons and supplies into large carts pulled by sturdy oxen. Rainfall, as the caravan leader, was organizing the final details when he approached Rigger. "Young Rigger, before you go." Rainfall extended a small object to Rigger. It was a piece of or carved into the shape of a shield, with 3 crossed swords engraved on its surface. "Show this to the guards at the main city of the coal mine tribe and tell them you're my friend. This should reduce their initial suspicion. Also, if you show them this sword and say you're here to modify it, they should let you in more easily as well." Rigger accepted the gift and examined it, admiring the craftsmanship in the details of the carving. "Thank you. This will be useful." Rainfall smiled. "If you're truly looking for a blacksmith capable of working on your sword, seek Gogbard. He is the current god of ore, the best we have. He prefers forging weapons from scratch, but if anyone can embed a magic stone into one of the 49 blades of Dragon King Kajikut, it's him." Rigger nodded respectfully. "I will seek him out." Before leaving, Rigger handed the dwarf some magical scrolls, carefully drawn with advanced level attack and healing circles. "In case you're attacked on the road, these scrolls might save lives. Good luck on your journey." Rainfall was surprised by the gesture, but thanked him with a firm nod. "You're more than a skilled warrior. If we encounter anyone from the Iron Legion you mentioned, we'll be friendly. May your journey be safe." With that, Rigger stepped back a few paces and leaped high into the air. In perfect synchronization, Skoll dashed beneath him and caught him midair with ease before speeding off toward the horizon. The dwarves watched the scene, impressed by the bond between the young man and the wolf. After a few more days of running, Rigger began noticing changes in the environment. The dense vegetation gave way to rockier terrain and majestic mountains rising in the distance. He knew he was nearing the main city of the coal mine tribe. When he spotted the first dwarves, they were on guard, weapons in hand. Clearly, the sight of Skoll, large and intimidating, had alarmed them. Rigger decided to proceed cautiously. He dismounted Skoll and walked alone toward the guards. "Stop right there," one of the dwarves shouted firmly. "Who are you, and why have you come here?" Rigger raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "My name is Rigger. I was told to seek a dwarven blacksmith for a special weapon. They say only you can handle something of this level." He slowly unsheathed Tsukikage, the blue blade gleaming in the daylight. The dwarves approached, fascinated by the weapon. "A sword like this?" One of the guards murmured. "You're right, lad. Only a dwarf could work on something like this." The dwarf declared proudly. Rigger felt like saying it wasn't a dwarf who forged it, but kept the thought to himself. The guard hesitated for a moment before continuing. "All right, you can enter, but the wolf stays." Rigger frowned. "Skoll comes with me. He's domesticated." The guards exchanged uneasy glances. Before they could insist, Rigger whistled and called Skoll. "Sit." The wolf immediately obeyed. "Roll over." Skoll spun on the ground without hesitation. "Play dead." Skoll dropped to the ground, motionless. "Also, Rainfall is my friend. He told me to show this to you so I could be allowed entry." He showed them the emblem. The dwarves were astonished, murmuring among themselves. It was rare to see an ebony wolf, and even rarer to see one so well trained. After more discussions and hesitations, the guards finally relented. "Very well, he can enter, but if he causes any trouble, it's on you, and we won't go easy." "Don't worry. He's more disciplined than he looks," Rigger replied with a slight smile, calling Skoll to follow. With that, he and the wolf passed through the gates that marked the beginning of the coal mine tribe's territory, ready to discover what the legendary dwarven city had in store. One of the guards followed Rigger to ensure he wouldn't be stopped for entering with a beast in tow. As they passed through the gates into the dwarven city, Rigger noticed a subtle change in temperature. The air became heavier, laden with heat and the scent of molten iron. Walking beside him was Fortwind, a dwarf with a thick, unruly beard and sharp eyes that never strayed from him or Skoll. The finely crafted hammer in Fortwind's hand symbolized his strength and rank. The entrance was a vast gallery leading to a larger cavern. The walls were adorned with runes and reliefs depicting ancient battles, blazing forges, and what appeared to be dwarven gods wielding tools instead of weapons. Fort Wind remained silent as they descended a gentle slope, their footsteps echoing in the passage. With each step, Rigger noticed the environment transforming. The natural rock gave way to tunnels reinforced with wooden beams and intricately carved stone. Using his magical eye, he detected faint mana flows within the walls, like shimmering veins pulsing in rhythm. Magical minerals, he thought. The energy was denser here than on the surface, almost as if the mountain itself were alive. When they reached the city proper, Rigger paused to take in the sight. The dwarven city was entirely subterranean, built within a colossal cavern that stretched for what seemed like miles. Massive crystals in the ceiling shone like stars, casting golden and orange hues that mimicked an eternal sunset. The air was filled with the rhythmic clanging of hammers striking metal, resonating from all directions. The buildings were sturdy, carved from stone with intricate details. Rounded doors and small windows adorned homes that, though compact, exuded resilience. Suspended bridges connected various parts of the city, while small underground rivers flowed along the edges, channeled through artificial canals likely used for drinking water or cooling the forges. The city wasn't solely comprised of forges. It hosted a variety of trades, though the dwarves' penchant for craftsmanship was unmistakable. The stares were unavoidable. Dwarves paused their work to watch him pass. Some eyed Skoll with obvious distrust, while others seemed genuinely curious. Rigger noticed children, even smaller than the adults, pointing at them, whispering excitedly to each other. A bolder group attempted to approach, only for an adult to pull them back with a stern glare directed at Rigger. "You sure cause a stir," Fort Wind remarked without turning around. "Maybe they're not used to visitors," Rigger replied, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "Visitors, yes, we see plenty. Merchants coming to sell rare minerals or buy the world's finest weapons. But you and that beast," he gestured slightly with his thumb toward Skoll, "are something they don't see every day." As they continued walking, Rigger reactivated his magical eye, observing more closely. Behind the walls and structures, he detected intense mana presences concentrated in certain areas of the city. Some were clearly enchanted objects, likely weapons, but others seemed to move, belonging to people. These dwarves had an impressive latent strength, something Rigger resolved not to underestimate. They eventually arrived at what appeared to be the heart of the city, an even larger cavern than the one before. It resembled a natural amphitheater, with tiers of structures encircling a massive central stone pillar that stretched from the ceiling to the mountain's depths. Here, the activity was at its peak. The hammering was louder, and the heat seemed to pulse through the air, creating subtle visual distortions. "This is the heart of the city. If the forges are our veins, this is the heart," Fort Wind explained, glancing sideways at Rigger. Rigger nodded. "It feels alive," he said, his tone reflecting a mix of admiration and caution. Fort Wind let out a short laugh. "You're here to see Godbard, right? He's over there." He pointed toward an isolated but clearly significant structure built around a crack in the cavern wall. Heat visibly radiated from it, and Rigger could feel the pulse of energy even from where he stood. "I'm not sure he'll want to speak with you," Fort Wind said hesitantly. "He will," Rigger replied confidently. Without further words, they began walking toward the structure. Along the way, Rigger continued to absorb every detail: the suspended bridges over glowing rivers, dwarf children darting among adults, artisans intently shaping iron and steel, and the powerful presences he felt pulsating beneath the surface. This city was a place filled with history and secrets, and he was ready to uncover them all. His master, Verdia, had once mentioned meeting the last or god. He had been a legitimate Earth God-level mage. From him, Verdia had learned her Earth King-level magic and had nearly mastered the Emperor-level earthquake spell. However, he was at the end of his life when he taught her, having lived since the Laplace Wars. Verdia had also mentioned the good fortune of Godbard's emergence as a talent in recent centuries to replace him. For the dwarves to have had a god-level mage in their final generation was impressive enough. If possible, Rigger wanted to attempt to learn that god-level spell himself. The closer they got to Godbard's forge, the more the heat intensified, reaching stifling levels. Rigger could feel it, but paid it little mind. His resistance to heat was extraordinarily high due to his combat style and extraordinary physique. Fort Wind, walking ahead, was drenched in sweat but pressed on, as though accustomed to such an extreme environment. Skoll, usually impassive, let out a low growl, clearly uncomfortable. The rhythmic sound of hammering grew louder and steadier, resonating like a heartbeat in the cavern's core. When they reached the entrance, Fort Wind pushed open the heavy metal doors. As soon as they entered, Rigger was struck by the sight of the forge, a vast space illuminated only by the fiery glow of flames, which danced in furnaces scattered along the sides. At the forge's center stood the current or god, leader of the dwarven tribe, god-bard of the splendid celestial peak, deeply focused on his work. The dwarf had the average stature of his race, but his presence was immense. His physique was honed, and he wore a leather apron darkened by years of use. His muscular arms, covered in soot, moved with absolute precision. His long, thick beard was braided and adorned with small iron rings engraved with runes. His eyes glowed like embers, reflecting the intensity of the surrounding furnaces. Rigger activated his magic eye, and what he saw made his heart race. The amount of mana in Godbard was colossal, rivaling his own. Rigger could confidently say he'd never seen anyone with more mana than Godbard, except himself, not even his master Verdia. He wasn't sure if it was enough for a god-level mage, as his magic eyes, while incredibly useful, weren't perfectly precise. Mana always appeared somewhat blurred. However, without a doubt, Godbard's mana was at least Emperor level. It emanated from him like an almost tangible aura. At that moment, Godbard was finishing a sword. The blade was made of a dark iron that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He cooled it in a vat of frigid water, releasing a blast of steam that filled the room. When the mist cleared, the blade gleamed with a dangerous intensity. Rigger, who had witnessed the work of some of the most skilled blacksmiths in Tinaver, some of them quite renowned, had to admit, none compared to this dwarf. Every hammer strike seemed to sculpt perfection, and the sword before him was a masterpiece that transcended mere craftsmanship. After the final touches, Godbard lifted the blade, examining it with critical eyes. Then, with a calm gesture, he set it on a nearby workbench and turned to face his visitors. Fort Wind quickly knelt, bowing his head in respect. "Or God, this boy wishes to speak with you. He wields one of Kajikut's 49 swords and is a friend of Rainfall," he said, his voice full of reverence. Rigger remained standing, with Skoll by his side. The wolf eyed the dwarf, as though sensing his strength. Godbard's eyes, deep and filled with stern wisdom, fell on Rigger. He raised an eyebrow and crossed his arms. "And who might you be, beast boy?" he said, his voice resonating like the sound of a hammer striking metal, "to stand without bowing before the Or-God?" As he spoke, his eyes locked onto Rigger's golden gaze with evident interest. The tone wasn't aggressive, but carried unquestionable authority, as though he was more curious than offended. Even so, the atmosphere seemed heavier, as if the sounds of the surrounding hammering had softened slightly, awaiting Rigger's response. Rigger stood his ground in the forge's center, his golden eyes fixed on the dwarf before him. "I am Rigger Adoldia, leader of the Iron Legion," Rigger began, his voice firm and full of authority. "I believe you've heard of me." Godbard didn't respond immediately. Instead, his narrowed eyes scanned Rigger from head to toe, taking in every detail, his crossed swords, his commanding presence, and especially his golden eyes, glowing like molten gold. After a moment of silence, Godbard tilted his head slightly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile appearing on his face. "The Red Wolf," Godbard said, testing the nickname. "I suppose that title suits you better in battle." He crossed his arms, adding with a tone that blended curiosity and subtle sarcasm, "I've heard you fight with a flaming sword, and that you breathe fire from your mouth." He chuckled softly, though his eyes continued to assess Rigger with caution. Rigger understood the underlying message immediately. Godbard was testing him, gauging his strength and character. The purpose of Rigger's visit wasn't just to modify his sword, though that was part of it. Why not seize the opportunity to bring the coal mine tribe into the Iron Legion? His goal was to make them allies, though from what he'd seen so far, they might be better as equals rather than subordinates. Rigger decided to increase the pressure. Without saying another word, he took a step forward and with a controlled motion, unsheathed Tsukikage, the blade shimmering in turquoise hues under the forge's light. Fort Wind moved instantly, gripping his hammer as his eyes locked onto the sword. He seemed ready to act at any moment. "Do you want a demonstration?" Rigger asked, his voice laced with challenge. Without waiting for an answer, he began channeling mana into the blade. Flames ignited around the sword, casting a bright glow that illuminated the surroundings. The temperature, which had already been uncomfortable, started to rise rapidly. "Skoll, wait outside," Rigger said calmly. But before he could finish his sentence, the wolf had already exited, as if anticipating what was about to happen. Godbard observed intently, his focus sharpening. An experienced blacksmith who had spent a lifetime in scorching forges, he was accustomed to intense heat. But now, his skin began to burn as if the air itself were aflame. Fort Wind, on the other hand, was already at his limit. He stepped forward, visibly uncomfortable, and opened his mouth to protest. "Sir, perhaps it would be better. Wait outside as well, Fort Wind," Godbard commanded, cutting him off. The guard hesitated, casting a worried glance at his leader, but eventually obeyed. The moment Fort Wind left, rigor intensified the flow of mana. The flames around Tsukikage began to shift in color. First, they transitioned from orange to a deep blue, then to a radiant purple. Each change brought a surge in temperature, and even the heat-resistant materials nearby started to succumb. Metal tools melted, and the stone floor beneath Rigger's feet began to warp and distort. Despite Rigger's careful control to prevent the heat from spreading across the subterranean city, the surrounding dwarves felt its effects. A wave of nearly unbearable heat radiated from the forge, stopping many in their tracks as they turned to look toward the building. Inside the forge, Godbard stood motionless, though his skin burned as it never had before. Still, he maintained a stoic posture, his eyes fixed on the boy before him. Rigger, too, felt the heat. Standing at the epicenter of his own magic, the flames around the blade were nearing catastrophic levels. However, with his exceptional physical resilience, the Tuki flowing across his skin for protection, and a regeneration spell constantly mending any damage, he bore the intense environment with little visible strain. Lifting Tsukikage high, he spoke in a calm yet commanding tone. "This is one of the 49 blades forged from the bones of the Dragon King Kajikut. Tsukikage. You can guess its ability just by looking at it, can't you?" Godbard didn't reply, his gaze locked on the blade, a mix of awe and dread in his eyes. Then, slowly, Rigger began to lower the sword. The flames surrounding it burned fiercely, and it seemed as though the blade was about to strike the ground and unleash an unimaginable explosion of heat. Godbard tensed, fully aware of what such magic could do to the heart of the city. But at the last moment, Rigger extinguished the flames entirely. The fire vanished in an instant, as though it had never existed. However, the residual heat released one final shockwave through the forge, causing tools and materials to rattle and vibrate. The blade touched the molten stone floor with a soft metallic sound. Rigger sheathed the sword with the same composure with which he had drawn it. Then, turning to Godbard, he ignored the dwarves who had started to gather around the forge, drawn by the intense heat. "I'm here to modify it," Rigger said firmly, "but I'd also like to discuss some cooperation." For a moment, Godbard remained silent, his eyes still fixed on the young man. But the initial astonishment on his face slowly gave way to something more profound: respect. Taking a step forward, he crossed his arms and inclined his head slightly, the heat still radiating from the ground beneath his feet. "You have my attention, leader of the Iron Legion," he said, his deep voice now tinged with genuine acknowledgement. "All right, Rigger Adoldia, correct? Let's take this conversation to a more appropriate place," Godbard said, cleaning the excess coal from his hands and walking toward the forge's exit. As they left the forge, the entrance was surrounded by armed dwarves. The dwarven guard, Fort Wind, stood at the forefront, seemingly preventing them from storming the forge. Their armor was dense and solid, with a dark sheen typical of mountain iron. One of the dwarves stepped forward, raising a calloused hand to block their path. "God of Ore," the dwarf said with a slight bow, his voice hoarse. "Who is this stranger?" Godbard raised a hand to calm the group. "It's all right, Galdar. This young man is an esteemed guest of the coal mine tribe. You can return to your posts." Galdar eyed Rigger suspiciously for a moment but then nodded, signaling to the other dwarves. They dispersed, some returning to the forge and others assuming positions around the tunnel. A few dwarves approached and greeted Rigger, thanking him for saving them at Zant Port. Rigger was surprised, but after some thought, he realized it made sense. He had visited Tinaver and taken his time along the way. The dwarves who traveled directly to their homeland must have arrived much earlier. These interactions helped ease the other dwarves' acceptance of his presence. Many regarded him with admiration and skepticism upon hearing of his feats. Rigger observed the scene of soldiers moving in an orderly manner, impressed by the dwarves' level of organization and discipline. "The dwarves' strength surpasses my expectations," he commented, attempting to lighten the tension. But he was genuinely impressed. The dwarves were all equipped with excellent weapons and armor, and their average mana levels seemed higher than the beast race. We do what we must. It wouldn't be feasible to have such fine weapons without warriors to protect them, Godbard replied as he resumed walking. Our people have suffered greatly because of thieves, slavers, and raiders. Much like the races of the Great Forest, the strategic location of this city and the alliances we've forged with some powers in human territories ensure that, at least within the city, you won't be attacked. Indeed, it's certainly a difficult place to lay siege to, Rigger remarked while imagining ways to invade. But it's not invulnerable. And as you said, you're confined to your territory, aren't you? Godbard gave Rigger a cautious look. That's right. There are some monsters that could wipe this mountain off the map, rendering any siege defenses useless. I've heard about what you did outside Zant Port. Rigger simply smiled. Skoll let out a low growl, seemingly complaining about the heat around them. They continued following Godbard through a tunnel that opened into a vast cavern. At the cavern's center, a monumental structure captured Rigger's attention. A massive tower, carved directly from the rock, rose to the cavern's ceiling like a supporting pillar. Magical lights glimmered along its spiral stairs, giving the environment an ethereal touch. The council tower, Godbard said, noticing Rigger's impressed gaze. This is where we make all the decisions for the tribe and safeguard our legacy. I can summon a council meeting tomorrow, depending on the terms you wish to discuss, but I'll hear you out alone today. Incredible. Rigger murmured, feeling small before the grandeur of the construction, not because of its size, but because of the intricate details and sculptures winding around the tower. It was truly a masterpiece to behold. The group climbed several staircases until they reached an ornate room. The walls were covered with detailed tapestries depicting dwarves in epic battles and legendary forges. At the center of the room, a long stone table dominated the space, surrounded by chairs with intricate carvings. Godbard motioned for Rigger to sit, but he remained standing, approaching a pedestal near the table. He observed Rigger for a moment before speaking. You wanted to talk about your sword, Godbard began, gesturing for Rigger to present it. Rigger nodded, carefully drawing the weapon from its sheath. He placed it on the table, where the blue gleam of the blade captured the torchlight, reflecting a nearly living azure glow. I want to embed a magic stone into it, he explained. Something similar to what's done with wands and staffs used by magicians, but without compromising its abilities. I want it to help me reach a new level of skill. Godbard stepped closer, his eyes scrutinizing every detail of the blade. He remained silent for long moments, his fingers tracing invisible lines in the air above the sword, as if sensing its energy. Finally, he shook his head. No. Rigger blinked, surprised. The conversation had been going well, and he expected this part to be relatively simple. What? But why? I am a creator, Godbard replied, his voice firm and definitive. I do not modify existing weapons. My work is to create from scratch, imbue each piece with my vision and purpose. Altering this sword would be a disrespect to its essence. It is already a masterpiece. Rigger frowned. He had traveled far to have this sword modified, and this was his answer? Couldn't you make an exception? Just this once. Godbard narrowed his eyes, as if the suggestion were almost offensive. No. This is my principle, and I will not break it. However, he gestured toward the room around them. Here in the tower, there are other blacksmiths, some almost as skilled as I am, and not all share my personal philosophy. I'm sure you'll find someone willing to help you. Rigger sighed, feeling disappointment settle over him, but he quickly pushed it aside. I understand, he said, trying to sound composed. Thank you. Skoll approached, sitting beside Rigger as if sensing his mild frustration. Fort Wind, on the other hand, floated in circles, seemingly intrigued by the unfolding situation. Rigger had come to the dwarven territory determined to hire the best of the best to modify his master's gift, whether through force or payment. But judging by Godbard's personality and what he had seen so far of dwarven society, the blacksmith could become an excellent ally under the right circumstances. He didn't want to ruin this chance just to make the sword a bit stronger. Besides, if he forced the matter, the final work might turn out poorly. In the ornate chamber atop the tower, Rigger and Godbard settled into intricately carved stone chairs, illuminated by a crystal chandelier that cast golden light across the walls. The atmosphere held a ceremonial weight. Rigger glanced at Skoll, resting calmly beside him, and then at Fort Wind, hovering near Godbard. Godbard, as you've likely guessed, I'm not here just to seek your help with my sword. I want to propose something bigger, something that would benefit both your tribe and the Iron Legion. The dwarf raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms over his broad chest. Go on. Rigger unfolded a map from his bag, highlighting Tinaver, the Great Forest, and Mealy's. He pointed to strategic regions. My legion is establishing bases throughout Mealy's, and we won't stop there. I'll spare you an inspiring speech about our goals. You probably already know enough about our activities. My proposal is simple. I want coal mine tribe dwarven blacksmiths working in these locations and teaching as well. In exchange, you'll receive full protection from our forces to trade safely outside your territories. I also have a mineral that might interest you. Godbard stroked his beard thoughtfully. Dwarves rarely leave their lands, Rigger. Not because we fear the outside, but because the world beyond the mountains is chaotic. And what exactly do you expect from our blacksmiths? I want to give dwarves the chance to operate on a larger stage, Rigger responded without hesitation. You're the best at crafting weapons, armor, and tools. I want that excellence to be available to those in need. With our protection and secured trade routes, your products could reach markets that were once unimaginable. On paper, that sounds very nice. But does the Legion already have that capacity? Godbard still seemed skeptical. We're far beyond what the dwarves have likely heard, and will keep growing as long as I'm there to defend them, Rigger said confidently. Godbard seemed to ponder for a moment. You mentioned a mineral? Rigger smiled, prepared for the question. He pulled a small shiny stone from his bag, not an ordinary stone, but a piece of mineral he had shaped himself using earth magic. The piece had a unique metallic black luster, with blue veins and a texture that seemed to defy the laws of nature. I call it erathium, he said, placing the stone on the table before Godbard. A mineral I created myself using earth magic. It's incredibly dense, durable, and resistant to any kind of impact. It's not easy to produce, it consumes a lot of mana and requires absolute concentration, but it's proof of what we can achieve working together. Godbard's eyes lit up as he examined the erathium. He turned it over in his hands, tapped it lightly with his fingers, and even pressed it against a short blade he carried at his belt. The metal seemed unyielding. Interesting, he murmured, carefully placing the stone back on the table. I've never seen anything like this. I'll need to test it in forging to see if it's as good as it looks, but if you could teach someone how to mold it, that would be ideal. Rigger nodded. That's the plan. I can teach the process of shaping erathium, but only to those who join the Legion. This will strengthen both your people and our cause. The dwarf leaned back, rubbing his chin. Interesting. We'd send only the young, the most promising, those with much to learn. And in return, you guarantee they'll have the freedom to return whenever they wish. Rigger nodded again. Agreed. More than that, if your tribe needs anything, raw materials, protection, military assistance, the Legion will be there. They spent hours refining the details, discussing terms, and outlining potential trade routes. Godbard suggested safe stops through the mountains, while Rigger mentioned how the elves of the Great Forest could collaborate with the dwarves, trading rare herbs for tools. The more Rigger spoke with Godbard, the clearer it became that the dwarf cared for two things above all, his tribe and his forge. As long as either benefited, Godbard would remain an ally. Rigger had brought both to the table. With each passing agreement, Godbard's demeanor grew warmer, his tone more like that of an old friend. Finally, when everything seemed settled, Godbard laughed, slapping the table. Young Rigger, you talk like a merchant, but have the heart of a warrior. Tomorrow, we'll present these ideas to the council. Tonight, we'll seal this alliance in true dwarven fashion, with a celebration worthy of the occasion. Rigger chuckled, relieved. A celebration? That seems fitting. Hope you're ready, Godbard teased. Dwarves throw parties that topple even the strongest. A grand feast was quickly announced, and the meeting hall transformed into a lively banquet. Long tables were set with roasted meats, rustic breads, fragrant cheeses, and barrels of frothy ale. The rich aroma even stirred Skoll, who rarely showed such interest, into growling in anticipation. Rigger started cautiously, serving himself a large cut of meat while observing the dwarves around him. They were already downing tankards and singing boisterous songs accompanied by rustic but skillfully crafted instruments. Fort Wind hovered above the crowd, vibrating in tune with the lively music. "Skål, enjoy yourself," Rigger said, tossing a hefty chunk of meat to the wolf, who caught it effortlessly mid-air. As the night wore on, Rigger decided to sample the dwarven ale. "It can't be that strong," he muttered, raising the tankard. The golden liquid burned on the way down, but he laughed. "Not bad." A few hours later, moderation was a distant memory. Rigger stood atop a table, thumping his chest and gesturing enthusiastically. "And then," he declared, his voice slurred but triumphant, "I drove my blade into his chest and blew half his torso apart." The dwarves roared in approval, urging him on. One particularly impressed dwarf shouted, "And what happened next, lad?" Rigger grinned, launching into another tale. "After that, I swept through the Black Troll's base and took out everything in that direction with a single sword strike." He twirled his blade dramatically, a move that nearly toppled a tray of mugs. Skål, sprawled nearby with a belly full of meat, let out a lazy growl of contentment. Even the wolf seemed to enjoy the infectious energy of the celebration, occasionally howling along with the rhythm of the songs. From across the hall, Godbard observed Rigger with an intrigued expression. Slowly, he approached, stopping before the young warrior and tilting his head. "Those eyes of yours, golden, aren't they? Now I remember why they seem familiar." Rigger blinked, his drunken grin still intact. "My eyes? What's so special about them?" Godbard crossed his arms. "The same eyes as the ancient god of Or, my master. He could see mana with those eyes. Can you?" Rigger blinked again, the words cutting through his haze of drink. "I can, but was he a dwarf? I thought that was unique to the beast race. Maybe it's more mysterious than I thought," he murmured. "To the golden eyes." Rigger lifted his tankard high. The dwarves laughed and joined in the toast, the festivities carrying on with more tales, songs, and food. Despite the revelry, Rigger felt truly welcomed. The dwarves were uninhibited and cheerful, their camaraderie making him feel as though he were among old friends. He knew this night would be etched in his memory, not just for the alliances forged but for the laughter shared. After the party's intensity, Rigger finally found a moment to retreat. Though the hall still echoed with singing and laughter, he slipped away to a room offered to him for the night. Skål lay beside the bed, snoring softly, clearly as exhausted as his master. Still feeling the dull weight of drink, Rigger took a deep breath and cast a detoxification spell. The magic coursed through him, washing away the effects of the ale and leaving him clear-headed. A satisfied smile crept across his face. "The dwarves are strong, but I can still best their ale," he murmured before collapsing onto the comfortable bed, his eyelids growing heavy. Sleep came swiftly, but instead of peaceful rest, Rigger felt himself being pulled elsewhere. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the dwarven halls. Instead, he stood in an infinite white expanse. There were no walls, no floor, no ceiling, only an oppressive, endless void. "Where am I?" he murmured, glancing around, trying to sense any magical presence. But there was only silence. Then, a figure appeared in the distance, walking toward him. The humanoid shape was pure white, without any discernible features, its face a blank mosaic save for a chilling malicious smile that stood out unervingly. "Hello, Rigger. I believe this is our first meeting," the figure spoke, its voice resonating from every direction at once. Point of view, Lilia Grerat Central Continent, Azura Kingdom. Fitoa region. It had been exactly 1 year since the birth of my daughter, Aisha Grerat, and Zenith's daughter, Norn Grerat. A year, and I still wondered how much my life had changed in such a short time. I, Lilia Grerat, the woman who almost ruined the Grerat family's life, was now a part of it, and everything I did seemed tied to this strange twist of fate. He forgave me. After everything I did, after who I was, he forgave me. I didn't know how to process it at the time. I couldn't understand it, but I knew that something in me, something in my heart, had shifted. Rudius. That boy who had always made me uneasy, who frightened me with his intelligence since birth, a mix of innocence and wisdom, had saved me. Saved both me and my daughter. That boy, whom I believed incapable of understanding the world around him with those enigmatic eyes of his, became my savior. I owed him everything. Of course, I also owed Zenith for allowing me to stay, and I would never forget that either. What they did for me, for Aisha, it was as if they had granted me a second life. From that day onward, I made a decision. I would raise my daughter to serve him. After all, She wouldn't even exist if not for him. She was still young, yes, but she already displayed an intelligence I hadn't expected from such a small child. I worried about it a little, knowing that Zenith's daughter, Norn, didn't share the same vigor or curiosity. I felt it was my responsibility to teach Aisha to respect her sister, so she wouldn't grow arrogant. At that moment, the two of them were seated at the table, eating porridge. Aisha, always lively, was more focused on playing with a toy that, without my noticing, she had stolen from Norn. "Aisha, you must treat Miss Norn with respect," I said, taking the toy and returning it to Norn, trying to maintain authority. Aisha looked annoyed at my scolding but soon sighed and gazed out the window as if wishing to escape the situation. I followed her gaze, distractedly, toward the sky. It was a beautiful day, with the sun shining and a gentle breeze in the air. But as I kept looking, I noticed something strange. The sky in the direction of Roa, the city governing the Fatoa region, was growing darker. Sinister clouds were forming, spreading in vibrant and bizarre colors across the horizon. A tightening sensation gripped my chest. I didn't know what it was, but I felt it wasn't normal. I grabbed Aisha and Norn, holding them close to my chest, trying to ward off the growing sense of dread. Aisha seemed excited by the sight, captivated by the sky's strange movements, but I was uneasy. It was a bad omen. Something terrible was about to happen. Paul and Zenith were too engrossed in their own affairs to notice the change in the atmosphere. Paul, with his lascivious looks, was attempting to flirt with Zenith as she hung clothes on the line, but neither of them seemed to notice the storm brewing. Almost without thinking, I turned to warn them, but before I could open my mouth, an explosion of light illuminated the sky, advancing rapidly toward the village. A light so intense it blinded my eyes for a moment, and a deafening roar followed in its wake. I pulled the two children closer to me, holding them tighter than ever, and screamed desperately, "Watch out!" It was the only thing I managed to say before being consumed by the light. Point of view, Rudius Grerat. I was sitting at the base of the tree, with Sylphie by my side. I was teaching her the principle behind cooling and heating using water magic. It was something fun, and Sylphie seemed to think of it as a game. Both of us were 7 years old now, and while I hadn't advanced much in magic since Master Roxy had left, I knew enough to teach her plenty of things. She was trying to modify an ice spell after it had been cast, but the ice cannon trembled and exploded into small shards, and her ears drooped in disappointment. "I failed again," she said, sitting down. "Don't worry, Sylphie, you'll get it. Try again, just focus a bit more," I said, trying to encourage her, and her mood instantly brightened. It wasn't anything new. Sylphie always seemed extremely happy with any praise I gave her. She was very cute, and that only made me want to protect her even more. Sylphie had no one else but me. She didn't have other friends, no one to play with, no one to lean on besides me. And I knew that. How could I leave her? How could I abandon such an adorable girl? I had received a letter from my master Roxy, saying she had become a king-tier mage, and I had told Sylphie that I planned to go to Renoa to study. But she was devastated and begged me not to go. I had made up my mind. When I returned home today, I would ask my father Paul to help pay for Sylphie tuition too. I was about to correct Sylphie magic again when something happened. A massive rumble shattered the tranquil silence of the afternoon. It was so powerful that the ground seemed to tremble. I looked up and saw an explosion of light heading toward us, fast as lightning, shining intensely with a color beyond description. Before I could do anything else, I threw myself forward, shielding Sylphie with my body, as if that could make any difference. The light engulfed everything. My senses blanked out momentarily. The flash completely blinded me, and the sound of the explosion seemed to come from everywhere, swallowing everything around us. I held Sylphie tightly, trying to protect her from it, but, in the blink of an eye, everything went white. Point of view, Ghislaine Didoldia. The sun was rising when I started training with Eris. She was focused, attacking fiercely with her sword, as she always did. Heya! Her energy was uncontrollable, something that reminded me so much of myself when I was younger. At the same time, she had extraordinary talent. I corrected the details in her stance, all while thinking about the heights she could reach. "Lower your shoulder," I said, watching closely. "Your feet are too close together. Remember, your stance is key to every strike." She was so eager that she didn't always focus on the finer details, but that didn't surprise me. Eris had boundless energy, and I liked that, but I knew it needed to be controlled. I glanced to the side for a moment, and there was Philip, Eris's father and the son of the Lord of Fitoa, Soros Boreas Greyrat. He was watching the training from the second floor of the house. He seemed calm as always, but I knew he was paying attention to every move. He was so involved in the household affairs that he rarely had time to watch the training, but even so, he occasionally observed from a distance. I looked at Eris as she came at me again and thought, if she could reach the saint level of swordsmanship by age 15, under my guidance, I would plan to take her to the sword sanctuary. But that was still years away, and on top of that, being a noble, she likely wouldn't have as much time to dedicate to the sword. Currently, she was at the beginner level of the sword god style, almost reaching intermediate. That was already impressive for a 9-year-old girl who had only started 2 years ago. However, something worried me. Eris didn't care much about anything else. She was exactly like me, a child who only cared about the sword, about fighting, about training. As a noble, she should learn more than just how to fight. She should be concerned with studying languages, proper noble etiquette. But like me, she showed no interest in any of that. Personally, I had struggled with this as an adventurer, but that was for her parents to deal with. As she tried to dodge my strikes, my senses sharpened. Something was wrong. I stopped the training abruptly, and Eris shouted excitedly, full of energy, "What is it, Ghislaine?" I momentarily ignored her, my gaze fixed on the sky. Something was happening. I lifted my eye patch, using my magic eye. What a colossal amount of mana, I thought to myself. I had never felt anything so massive, so powerful. This wasn't normal. Something was coming, and it was immense. "Master Philip," I said firmly, without taking my eyes off the sky. "Alert the guards." He noticed the seriousness in my eyes, and after looking up at the sky, he made a gesture with his hand, signaling to the guards nearby. They began to prepare, and Philip moved toward the stairs to give more specific orders. "Young miss," I said, already turning to her, "let's go to your mother." She looked confused, agitated, and shouted, "What's going on, Ghislaine?" I didn't know, but I felt that something big was about to happen. We needed to act fast. On the way, as we left the training field, something happened. An explosion of light illuminated the sky and the earth. I instinctively threw myself over Eris, trying to shield her. The light was so intense, so immense, that it seemed to swallow everything around it, including the entire Fitoa region. And then, everything turned white. Point of view, Rigor Adoldia Rigor was surrounded by an absolute void. White stretched in all directions, dense and immeasurable. He felt his instinct screaming danger, as if a predator was watching him. "Hello, Rigor-kun. I think this is our first meeting," a voice said, casual and carefree, but the malice in its tone made every hair on Rigor's body stand on end. He reacted instantly, trying to draw his sword, but his hand found nothing. Looking down, he noticed something strange. He was completely naked. While his body still had the appearance of a beastman, with his defined muscles and familiar features, he had no weapons or clothes. A mocking laugh echoed. "This is your spiritual body," explained the white figure in front of him. A man entirely white, with a mosaic-like face and a carefree smile, looked at him with amusement. "You don't carry your weapons here. Fascinating, isn't it?" Rigor frowned, ignoring the comment. He prepared his claws and focused, trying to sense his surroundings. He closed his eyes, searching for something, anything, with his magical perception. But he found nothing. Only an oppressive void. "Who are you?" he asked, keeping his tone cold while his eyes assessed the strange being from head to toe. "I am a god," said the man, still smiling. "The human god, Hitagami." Rigor narrowed his eyes. Many people assume grand titles without any qualifications. "What qualifications do you have?" Hitagami seemed surprised but laughed again. "That's quite offensive. I've been protecting you this whole time throughout your life." As he spoke, Rigor analyzed his options. Every primal instinct within him screamed that this man was exceedingly dangerous. He tried gathering magic, experimenting with summoning different types of barriers, but it was challenging. Something was blocking his magic, making everything harder than it should be. "Protecting me?" Rigor retorted, keeping his tone dry. "I don't recall you helping me with anything, and why would you? I'm not human, human god. And how did you enter my dreams?" He feigned disinterest but was paying attention to every detail. I told you I'm a god, replied Hitagami, smiling as if amused. I rarely get the chance to talk to someone. Certain things need to align. Today, I came to give you advice. Rigor narrowed his eyes further. Answer my questions first, then say what you want. Hitagami raised his hands in a theatrical surrender. Calm down, calm down. I'm your ally here. Rigor's eyes gleamed with defiance as he sarcastically thought, and I'm Superman. He didn't believe him one bit. His instincts had never failed him since arriving in this world, and everything about that being felt wrong. Well, Hitagami continued, still in his relaxed and sarcastic tone, it's up to you whether you follow my advice or not, but it will help you become much stronger. Rigor remained on guard, alert for any clue on how to escape. But before he could pressure the strange man further, Hitagami tilted his head and said, Speak to the dwarf outside the city. Brightstone of the deep earth. Ask him to improve your sword. That will help you grow much stronger. Before he could respond, Rigor woke up with a start, his heart pounding. He was back in his room in Godbard's house. Skoll, who had been sleeping on him, was startled by the sudden movement and looked at him with confusion. Rigor ran a hand over his face, trying to process what had just happened. Spoiler, this marks the first major canonical change in this fanfic. In the canon, the teleportation incident was caused by events that happened approximately 80 years in the future. During a war, a nation used the power of a playback Miko to summon a boy from another world, prophesied to be their savior, Nanahoshi's boyfriend, who had been arguing with her during the accident. The Miko developed feelings for him, but the boy, being just a regular human without powers, died on the battlefield. Consumed by grief, the Miko burned through her power to alter time and space, trying to create a future where she and the boy could live happily. She searched for someone who had similar feelings for the boy, his girlfriend from his original world, Nanahoshi. She tried to summon her to the Fitoa region, where she was located 80 years in the past, in the hope of preventing the boy's death. However, the world resisted the alteration of fate, and initially, nothing happened. Eventually, the summoning attempt created a rift in space, from which the soul of a nearby deceased individual emerged and reincarnated into the world, Rudius. Over time, the world's resistance weakened as Rudius altered the fate of various people, until the rift finally fulfilled its purpose when Rudius was 10 years old, summoning Nanahoshi and triggering the teleportation incident. In this fanfic, I consider that the combined changes caused by Rudius and Rigor would make the teleportation incident happen earlier, which also gives me room to have Rigor meet the characters I want him to. So, the teleportation incident occurred 3 years earlier than in the original timeline. Rudius is 7 years old, and Rigor is 10. Some may like this, others may not, and some won't care. But that's the decision I made. I hope you enjoy. Rigor started his morning by calming Skoll, who had been restless ever since waking up tense and battle-ready. After some time, the wolf finally settled down and accompanied Rigor to his commitments. He headed toward Godbard's forge, while the dwarves around him were already immersed in their work, as if the previous day's festivities had never happened. It was impressive how they managed to return to their routine without detoxification magic to help them. As he walked, Rigor's thoughts wandered to the dream he'd had. It felt too real to be just a product of his mind. He didn't trust this human god, Hitagami, not in the slightest, but investigating the motives behind that vision seemed inevitable. Moreover, he needed to find a way to shield himself from these dreams, perhaps some kind of mental barrier, if such a thing even existed. When he arrived at Godbard's forge, he found the dwarf working intensely, testing the Erathium that Rigor had negotiated with him. Upon seeing him, Godbard greeted him warmly, stepping away from his tools for a moment. "Good to see you, lad," said the dwarf, wiping the sweat from his brow with a cloth. "This Erathium is fascinating. You did a great job with this." "I'm glad it's useful, Godbard. As we agreed, I hope you'll make a short sword with this first piece of ore. I've been looking for a durable secondary weapon for a while now," Rigor replied with a slight smile. Godbard laughed. Sure, but is that the only reason you came here?" Rigor spoke in a neutral tone. "There's another reason." The dwarf raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "I still want to embed my sword with a magic stone. And since you said you couldn't help me with that, I thought I'd ask, who do you recommend among everyone?" Godbard pondered for a moment and began listing several skilled blacksmiths, all dwarves, renowned for their ability to work with rare metals and magic stones. However, none of them was Brightstone, the name Hitagami had mentioned in the dream. Rigger frowned. In truth, it would be better if that were the case. He could ignore that god if this person turned out to be insignificant. He set the topic aside for the time being. All right. And who's the best among them? Who's the best enchanter among the dwarves? Godbard's expression grew serious for a moment. All the ones I mentioned are among the best. Rigger noticed the evasive tone and pressed further. But who's the best? The dwarf let out a deep sigh, showing some reluctance. You won't want to work with him. He may be the best, but he's also a madman. His name is Brightstone of the Deep Earth. Rigger raised his eyebrows, intrigued. There it was, the dwarf the god had recommended. So, he was the best? Madman. Yes. Nobody likes him around here, Godbard replied, with a faint expression of disdain. But honestly, I won't lie, he's probably the best weapon enchanter there is, maybe in the entire world. Rigger felt inclined to ignore this, but Godbard's words held weight. Where is he? Outside the city. As I said, nobody likes him here. The young warrior nodded, but his mind was already working through the possibilities. Just as Hitagami had said, the dwarf resided outside the dwarven city. Before moving on, Rigger fixed his gaze on the dwarf and asked, Godbard, do you know anyone named Hitagami? Godbard's reaction was one of pure confusion. Hitagami? Never heard of him. Is he some famous enchanter among humans? Rigger observed closely, paying attention to the dwarf's heartbeat, the hairs on his arms, and the subtle changes in his facial expression. Over time, he had honed his ability to read body language to detect lies. It wasn't foolproof, but overall, it worked well. Godbard seemed to be telling the truth. He's no one, Rigger said calmly. But if you ever hear that name or find out anything, let me know. All right, Godbard replied, not giving it much thought. With the topic closed, Godbard resumed talking about the blacksmiths. Rigger decided to follow his recommendation and set out through the city to meet them. A guard named Fortwind was assigned as his escort. As they walked, Rigger remained lost in thought, already planning his next steps in the investigation. Rigger carefully held a sword, analyzing every detail as the blacksmith explained the technical limitations with a firm but patient tone. The problem is the size of the magic stone. If it's too large, it won't fit properly into your sword, the dwarf pointed to the narrow blade with a thick, calloused finger. Broad swords allow more flexibility for this type of work, but ideally, it should be a mage's staff. Only they can house the enormous magic stones of rank B beasts and above, as their purpose isn't to cut or strike. Rigger frowned. So, is it impossible? The blacksmith shrugged, crossing his arms. For me, yes. But I've heard stories about Brightstone. They say he can handle this kind of thing with a technique he created, but... He paused, scratching his beard with a look that suggested he was carefully choosing his words. But what? Rigger asked, tilting his head slightly, already anticipating something unusual. But he's extreme. Crazy, maybe. A true genius, but no one around here likes the way he does things. Rigger sighed, glancing back at the sword. He had already visited every forge recommended by Godbard. He had analyzed their work, asked each blacksmith about Brightstone, and without exception, all praised him as an unrivaled enchanter. But the stories of his eccentric personality and dangerous methods were always the same. Rigger hesitated. The fact that Hitagami had mentioned and recommended Brightstone's name only made him more suspicious. He wondered, if that self-proclaimed god hadn't brought up the dwarf, would he have sought him out anyway? Or would he simply have followed the standard recommendations? After a long moment of silence, he finally made a decision. I like your swords, Rigger said, looking at the blacksmith. But I'll visit Brightstone. If I don't like him or what he offers, I'll come back to your forge. The dwarf gave a satisfied smile and inclined his head in appreciation. You're welcome here anytime, kid. I hope you find what you're looking for. With that, Rigger left the forge accompanied by Fortwind, who walked at his side like a shadow, and Skoll, who seemed eager to leap and run around at any moment. As they made their way toward the exit of the dwarven city, Rigger used the walk to learn more about Brightstone. What do you know about him? Rigger asked, glancing at the guard. Fortwind scratched his chin before answering. Brightstone's always been Peculiar. I've known him since I was a kid. They say that the first time he saw magic, he became utterly fascinated. When they taught about mages' enchantments, he was way more excited than when it came to forging. Rigger raised his eyebrows, intrigued. He always preferred magic over weapons or armor, and he had an obsession with magical stones and shiny minerals. Fort Wind paused, shaking his head. That's how he got the name Brightstone. But that obsession also brought problems. He started doing crazy experiments, constantly causing explosions and destroying nearby houses. That made the other dwarves distance themselves from him. Over time, he was completely ostracized. He was eventually exiled after destroying a sword crafted by the former god of, or while attempting a new technique, and now no one visits him, except his son, who they say still brings him supplies now and then. Rigger listened attentively as they walked. Brightstone's story wasn't much different from what he had expected, but the fact that the dwarf was rejected by his own kind still made him question his decision. How old is he? Rigger asked. Over 300, Fort Wind replied. He was born more than 100 years before me, so he must be around 350 now. Few still remember him. They continued walking along the stone trails, winding through the mountains. The sunlight reflected off the rocks, and the sound of strong winds in the ridges created a tense atmosphere. The silence between them was broken only by Skoll's footsteps as the wolf ran excitedly, leaping from rock to rock. "Skoll, stay close!" Rigger shouted. "And watch your footing!" The wolf paused, turning to Rigger for a moment before continuing more cautiously. After hours of walking, they finally spotted the entrance to a cave. It was a massive opening, more than 7 meters tall, surrounded by stones faintly glowing with minerals. Fort Wind stopped beside Rigger, pointing to the cave. "There it is. Brightstone's home." Rigger took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the darkness that awaited inside the cave. "Let's go in," he said. They moved into the cave, observing their surroundings. Rigger noticed magical items fixed to the walls, resembling lamps with magical flames inside. These lights illuminated the path with a soft orange hue, highlighting the irregularities of the damp walls. Curious, Rigger activated his magic eye, analyzing the details. He realized that the entire cave contained a surprising amount of mana in its walls. The magical lamps seemed to draw small amounts of mana from the environment to keep the flames continuously lit. It was unlike anything he had seen before, a symbiosis between the natural environment and magic. Although it wasn't uncommon to find mana-rich locations, seeing such an efficient and constant application was intriguing. Fort Wind walked calmly beside him, seemingly accustomed to the sight. They ventured deeper into the cave, their footsteps echoing against the walls, until they arrived at a large metal door that appeared centuries old. The structure was sturdy, with various runes etched into it, faintly glowing to indicate active magic. Fort Wind stopped in front of the door and knocked firmly, producing a sound that reverberated through the corridor. Then he shouted, "It's me, you old lunatic. Open up already." For a moment, all was silent. Then a muffled voice responded from within, all right, I'm coming." This was followed by the sound of objects falling, glass shattering, and something heavy being dragged. Rigger raised an eyebrow, while Fort Wind just sighed, clearly used to the scene. After a few minutes, the door creaked open, revealing a stocky dwarf with disheveled silver hair and beard cascading down his robust frame. He looked slightly annoyed, but his eyes gleamed with curiosity as he glanced at Fort Wind and then at Rigger. "To what do I owe this visit?" asked the dwarf, his tone shifting between irritation and interest. Rigger stepped forward, inclining his head respectfully. "My name is Rigger Adoldia. I may have a job for you." The dwarf crossed his arms and tilted his head, clearly intrigued. "A job, huh? Come in, kid, and tell me what it is." The group entered the workshop, and Rigger immediately noticed the chaos of the place. It was an incredibly spacious and well-lit area, but utterly disorganized, with tools, scrolls, blades, and magical crystals scattered everywhere. Tables were covered in unfinished projects, and forge equipment occupied much of the room. A peculiar smell filled the air, a mix of hot metal, coal, and something he couldn't immediately identify. The dwarf watched Rigger with interest while picking up something from one of the tables, as if expecting to hear something extraordinary. Rigger remained alert, analyzing the man carefully, before asking, "Before we discuss the job, I need to know one thing. What? The dwarf asked, frowning. Rigger met his gaze directly, his eyes reflecting caution. Do you know someone called Hitagami? The dwarf scratched his head and completely nonchalantly stuck a finger in his nose. Hitagami? Never heard of him. Why? Is that necessary to take the job? Rigger continued observing the man intently, activating his magic eye once again to try and detect anything unusual. He analyzed every detail, body movements, tone of voice, the mana flow around him. To his surprise, nothing raised any suspicions. Internally, he sighed in relief. No, it's not necessary, he said, changing the subject. But to be honest, I'm still hesitant to follow that god's advice. Everyone says you're the best at what you do, but I want something different this time. The dwarf raised an eyebrow, now even more intrigued. And what do you have in mind? I want to imbue a magic stone into my sword. As he spoke, he drew the blue blade, its surface shimmering faintly under the workshop's light. Its name is, before he could finish, Brightstone jumped in excitement, his eyes widening as he shouted, Tsukikage. Without hesitation, he rushed over to Rigger and carefully took the blade from his hands as if it were a sacred artifact. Rigger observed cautiously. His instincts told him the man wasn't a threat. He lacked any signs of someone accustomed to combat. However, the fact that the strange god Hitagami had recommended Brightstone kept him on edge. Brightstone examined the sword with a gleam in his eye, turning it this way and that, inspecting every detail. I've made something similar before, he said, without taking his eyes off the blade. In fact, I have an example for you. Before Rigger could respond, the dwarf disappeared into an adjacent room, rummaging through the clutter. The sounds of metal being dragged and objects falling echoed through the workshop until he returned, carrying an enormous sword. Here it is. This is a magic sword I found in a labyrinth, and I embedded it with the magic stone of an A-rank beast. Brightstone announced proudly. The weapon was impressive, a broad blade about 1.7 meters tall and 20 centimeters wide, made of shiny silver metal. Several dark magic stones were embedded along its surface, emanating a powerful aura. Rigger took the sword with both hands. The moment he held it, he could feel the magical efficiency it provided. The blade's mana conductivity was remarkable, offering refined and powerful control. However, he knew that his affinity with Tsukikage, the sword given to him by his master, was irreplaceable. Its compatibility with his fighting style was perfect. He swung the sword a few times, activated his magic eye, and analyzed the dwarf's craftsmanship. Every detail of its construction confirmed Brightstone's reputation. It seemed he had used some technique to split the magic stone into small gems without losing any of their power, allowing larger stones to be utilized in his creations. His skill was indeed far beyond any other blacksmith Rigger had encountered. Impressive. Rigger handed the sword back, now fully convinced of Brightstone's mastery. The dwarf finally took his eyes off Tsukikage and looked at Rigger with a confident smile. Yes. That sword will be perfect. And I already know the ideal payment for this job. Rigger raised an eyebrow, curious. And what would that be? Brightstone crossed his arms and declared, convince the dwarves to kill the white-eyed blue dragon. Fort Wind, who had been leaning against one of the walls, scoffed in frustration and exclaimed, not this again, Brightstone. We've already told you that thing can't be killed. How many more are you going to send to their deaths before you understand? Rigger furrowed his brow. White-eyed blue dragon? Fort Wind sighed and explained, it's a mutant blue dragon. He's been trying to hunt it down for years to get its magic stone. The argument is that it lives alone, making it one of the few blue dragons that can be hunted without attracting others. But it's not that simple. It's an S-class mutant beast. Whatever the price, Rigger, refuse this. Brightstone, completely ignoring Fort Wind, shouted, Fort Wind, wait outside. I think the boy can decide for himself. After all, only a strong warrior could wield a sword like that. Fort Wind muttered something under his breath but stayed put, arms crossed, glaring at the dwarf. Rigger took a deep breath, carefully considering his options. Don't worry, Fort Wind. If I decide to do this, I'll go alone and won't involve the coal mine tribe. Brightstone grinned, clearly delighted. Don't worry, boy. The dragon may be strong, but it's blind. It relies primarily on its hearing and sense of smell. I'll provide you with 2 magical items to mask both your scent and the sound around you, completely erasing your presence. Rigger remained silent, deep in thought. He wasn't concerned about whether he could kill the dragon. As part of his S-Class adventurer mission, he already planned to hunt blue dragons. What truly troubled him was the possibility that this was part of Hidegami's scheme, but he was beginning to think he might be overthinking it. He analyzed the circumstances once more. Brightstone, despite his eccentricity, was genuine. His blacksmithing skills were real, and Rigger felt he would have ended up in this situation even without the god's interference. Still, he promised himself to retreat at the slightest sign of anything suspicious. Having made his decision, he finally said, "Very well. I accept. Where is this dragon?"
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.